It's okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and sorry for a short delay. We had some technical issues, as you probably imagine. So I would like to start by welcoming you to the WTO's Virtual Agriculture Symposium of 2020 on agricultural trade and food system transformation. Our session this afternoon will look at agricultural trade and the lessons learned from COVID-19 or the lessons non-learned. We'll see that in a second. I am Ulla Kaisk. I work at the WTO in the Agriculture Division, and I will be moderating this session. I would like to start by giving a little bit of context to this session. So it has been now almost a year since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are therefore beginning to get a little insight to be able to analyze with more accuracy its impact as more data and information become available. So this afternoon, we are going to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on agriculture and trade, main challenges the governments, producers, and traders have been facing, and different policy responses around the world. The goal of this session is to identify the lessons that can be learned to be better prepared in future. As you will remember, at the outbreak of the pandemic, governments were focused mainly addressing the most urgent twin concerns: containing the virus to save lives and feeding the populations. The very first measures put in place therefore included lockdown measures that had an impact on both food production and consumption. Many feared a breakdown of agricultural supply chains and the collapse of trade vital for the food security of so many people around the world. In parallel, governments started to adopt measures that also affected trade directly. These measures included both measures that facilitated trade, but also measures that restricted trade. These measures were phytosanitary measures put in place right in the beginning of the crisis, tariff reductions as governments were worried about lack of food in their domestic markets, but also export restrictions that were imposed by some of the food exporters for the very same reason. We also saw an increase in stockpiling, both by the governments and by private consumers. I think we all remember these pictures we saw on news of empty shelves in supermarkets around the world. After gradually, governments moved to start to mend the broken supply chains and to help agricultural producers to cope with this new normal situation. These measures included notably fiscal incentives and other support measures, and were aimed at building resilience and supporting producers' revenues, among others. So the panel here today will attempt to look in more detail at what actually happened to agricultural trade, what have been the main challenges, has our collective response to the crisis been appropriate, is the worst over, and what lessons can we or should we learn? So let me now introduce you to our distinguished panelists. So on the panel today, we have Claire Citeau. Claire is the Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance. We have Lian Jackson. Lian is the head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. We have Joseph Schmidhuber. Joseph is the Deputy Director of the Markets and Trade Division at the FAO. And last but not least, we have Cheryl Spencer. Cheryl is the Ambassador of Jamaica to the WTO and also the coordinator of the ACP group in Geneva. Before giving floor to the panelists, I want to remind our viewers that should you like to ask questions to our panelists, you will need to register. So those watching us on YouTube, if if you want to ask questions, you can quickly register. Otherwise, you will miss this opportunity. Now to the panelists. So let me start maybe with Joseph. Joseph, you have been working a lot on agricultural trade and a lot this year, obviously, on the impact of COVID-19 on agricultural trade. So when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, there were many fears about trade breaking down and the big food security impact this could have. Can you tell us, now that we have had time to look at the impact of COVID-19, what really happened? Did our worst fears materialize?
Thank you very much, Ulla. Let me actually show my screen because I prepared a little presentation. I hope it will work. Just okay. A little sign that it works would be very much appreciated.
No, we don't see yet the presentation.
Still not visible?
Now it's good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot. Good. And thanks for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. It's an honor for me to give that presentation. Before I start, however, a word of caution may be in order. You already announced that this is assessment of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on international trade, and that's essentially what you see here. It's not, in the strict sense, an impact assessment. What it really is, it's comparing a period before the outbreak with a period, I shouldn't say after the outbreak, but the data for the most recent month for which we have information. So I'm comparing before, after, or before with what's currently happened, not with and without. That means that all the changes that are being discussed are essentially including all other factors that play the role at the same time, and that can be, say, the African swine fever, or that can be a change in the exchange rates, and so on and so forth. Okay, with this, let's go. So I have essentially 6 major points that I'd like to address. The first is just setting the scene, and you've done this already, so I can go through that very quickly. We'll then look into what happened to global trade in the short run and the long run. Start with total merchandise trade, get into agriculture, look into the impacts across countries, the changes in prices and relative prices, and then eventually look into some country-specific exposure profiles. Good. So setting the scene. Actually, even very recent analyses describe the initial decline in trade as a collapse in international trade. And the conclusion is that the trade contractions from COVID-19 are deeper than those resulting from the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And similar statements can be found for agriculture. So the question is, as you alluded to already, what really happened and what do the data say? So let's have a look at the data, and starting with actually total merchandise trade. So that is essentially trade for all goods, excluding services, but it's not only agriculture, it's everything in terms of traded goods. And there are 2 different slides or 2 different pictures. On the left side, we have essentially total merchandise trade in current dollars. On the right side, it's in volumes. And I'm coming back to that in a second. But let me first explain what you see. So the salmon-colored bars are essentially monthly trade values from 2005 to 2020. August 2020 is the last month. And there are 2 oscillators at the same time on the chart, a blue line and a green line. Both are essentially looking at changes month on month, but the blue line is comparing a month with a month of the previous year, and the green line is comparing a month with the previous month. So the blue line is essentially the oscillator that captures the big swings, and the green line is the oscillator that captures the small swings. So if we look at the development over the last 15 years, what we see, of course, here is the global financial crisis. We are well aware of this. It really resulted in a collapse in trade. And we see this nicely from the annual oscillator really taking a deep dive. Then there is also something that, and I'll come back to this, is a bit of a trade recession between 2014 and 2016. It's actually not so well described in the literature. And now let's focus a little bit here on the last couple of months. And we see immediately in terms of values, that is not really different from what we've been seeing in the past. Of course, there is a decline in total merchandise trade, but there is also a recovery. And actually, June, July, August are months where we are close to the pre-COVID levels already. Now, economists always show this slide on the left side, but it's actually not a good idea because that is something that conflates a number of different things. Importantly, the quantities with the prices. And what we'd like to know actually is we would like to be able to recoup the quantities or the volumes. And how do we do this? We do it essentially by expressing trade in constant prices. And that's what you see on the right slide. And there's a huge difference between these two slides. So we still see the global financial crisis, trade taking a dive, but also recuperating quickly. And then here in the COVID period, we see actually that volumes are coming back very nicely, even more significantly than values. But that means the corollary of this is essentially that prices for total merchandise goods as a weighted average is declining. So we have cheaper total merchandise trade, which is good for the importers, probably not so good for the exporters, but that's what we observe. So in terms of trade contraction, and that of course doesn't mean that we don't see more in the future, but the trade contraction was a walk in the park compared to what we've seen during the global financial crisis. Of course, there was a very sharp temporary dive, no doubt about this. But if this was a V-shaped recovery, then this is probably an I-shaped recovery. Good. So the next slide may be a bit controversial, and I apologize in advance for this. The intention is by no means to zero in on the WTO, but these were the WTO predictions. The WTO does a fantastic job in monitoring trade, and actually the WTO, of course, has changed these predictions and has changed the evolution. But what is important is relative to even the most benign outcome predicted in April this year, we are in a way not seeing that contraction in trade at all. We are even above the green line, so overall it's much better. Okay, let's move from total merchandise trade to agricultural trade. These are the things we are normally concerned with. Good. Now, again, the values here, and we see, of course, the big oscillations during the global financial crisis, and also the same trade contraction during 2014, 2016. And actually, it's a development with a slight trend with seasonal variations. If we look at the COVID period for values in trade, there is no discernible impact whatsoever. So at the aggregate level, there is nothing. Of course, we will dig deeper into this and see whether there's something underneath. Again, much more interesting than just the nominal values are the constant price volumes. And if we look at this, then agricultural trade is just moving along with some seasonal variations in a very stable manner. There's a bit of a difference between total merchandise trade and agricultural trade insofar as agricultural volumes are actually slightly declining as of late, whereas values are keeping up, meaning that agricultural prices are actually doing well. I come back to that in a moment. But this is actually was predictable, and I take credit for that because we predicted it. Bing Zhao, Jonathan Pound, and I wrote a paper saying essentially that agricultural trade will not be strongly affected, and we gave 4 reasons. The first is demand for agricultural products, import demand, is very income inelastic. So it's the last thing countries actually reduce. The second is agricultural trade, for the biggest part of it, is trade in bulk commodities. So a health crisis is unlikely to affect this because it's highly automatized, highly labor-saving, capital-intensive trade. The third is agricultural supply chains are no doubt getting more complex, but they are nowhere nearly as complex as, say, for consumer electronics. So colloquially put, one needs 1,000 parts and 80 countries contributing to an Apple iPhone, but it's much easier to trade an Apple. And the last reason is, and that's with great kudos to the WTO, the policy response was much more benign than during the last crisis. And that was predictable insofar as prices were also much lower. So there was no incentive to put the feet on the brake and actually stop exports, impose export restrictions in a wholesale manner. There were, of course, some, or even go to export bans. So let's zoom in on the last couple of months just to make sure that this is not a crime by chart. Here, the agricultural values and the agricultural volumes over the last 20 months, I should say, hardly anything that can be distinguished from a normal development. We do see this strong reduction for total merchandise trade, both in terms of values and in terms of volumes, no doubt. So that did have an impact, but we will see that, and this is already visible here, there was a short-lived reduction. Okay, so let's move on to the impacts across countries. And this is only agricultural trade. I'll completely move away now from total merchandise trade. And the chart needs a bit of explanation, but it looks complicated, but it's very easy. So I'm comparing here the changes between the first semester of 2020 and the first semester of 2019 in absolute terms. And on the horizontal axis, you see the change in imports. On the vertical axis, you see the change in exports. And the only difference here is it's in percentages here, and here it's in $1 billion. So normally what we would see, like to see under normal circumstances, is that most of the bubbles are in the upper right quadrant because trade is gradually increasing. And so there should be more countries where we see higher imports and higher exports. Clearly that was not the case, but it didn't look very bad either. It was essentially, it's a chart where most of the bubbles are around the origin. There are exceptions, and they are partly related to COVID. So we see stronger exports from Latin American countries, that's Brazil and Argentina. We see less exports from some European countries, including and also the US. And we see much higher imports from China. So the reasons for this, I mentioned this already, in part this is COVID related. We saw strong devaluations or depreciations of the currencies in Latin America. More generally, the commodity currencies went down. We have China as the country that first got into the crisis, but also first got out of the crisis and has very strong growth. At the same time, actually saw an appreciation of its exchange rate, and that essentially meant that China is a strong buyer, and at the same time, China is making good for the impacts of the African swine fever outbreak. So clearly, that's one of the key factors driving that. If we now do not compare the whole semester, but just the last couple of months, we see already that most of the countries are in the upper right quadrant. So it's a normalization of trade, particularly when expressed in relative terms, so in percentages. Of course, the big changes still remain here. They are not necessarily COVID related, or if they are only partially or indirectly COVID related. Good. So let's have a quick look at prices and relative prices, and I can be quick because much of this has already been mentioned. If we look at the overall index of prices for total merchandise trade, then we essentially see a constant decline. That was already clear because we saw values going down faster than volumes going down, and the corollary is that the weighted aggregate price is going down. And we see the opposite for agriculture. And if we could continue this into November, we would see agricultural prices even go further. So if we take essentially the relative prices between these two, we end up with the relative prices of agriculture to total merchandise trade, and that is strongly going up. So it's even stronger if we take the ratio, not the share. And that essentially means that terms of trade are moving in favor of agriculture in a very strong way for many of the agricultural exporters. So it's good news. If you want, this is a typical anti-Prebisch-Singer moment of agricultural trade. And it's not unusual for a crisis. Actually, always happens during crisis. It happened in 74, it happened in 2007, 2008, and now it happens again. There is a change in that overall terms of trade development over the last 13 years, and it's an interesting development. If that is something to last, it will trigger all sorts of revisions in policy recommendations. Now, not everything that glitters is gold, and there are, of course, a lot of challenges for countries. And I only will show one slide that essentially brings these together. So we try to essentially put together scorecards for countries with high exposure. So high exposure is vulnerability, it's not necessarily impact. And this is essentially bringing them together, and we have it for 205 countries, and here only, I think these are 24 different ones. And it's clear some countries have been really heavily exposed because they are heavily dependent on cereal imports, on food imports more generally. They spend a lot of their revenues from total merchandise exports on agricultural imports. That share can be more than 100% because their services are not in there, aid is not in there. They are heavily dependent on tourism. They are heavily dependent on remittances. And the consumers spend a lot of their income on food. So there are a number of patterns in here which perhaps are difficult to discern, but one pattern is the SIDS, the small island developing states, are heavily exposed. They were not as heavily impacted as they were exposed. I'm happy to explain this, and the same holds actually for many other countries. And that has to do with the fact that remittances, for instance, didn't turn out to be so bad. We actually probably have a record year of remittances this year, and I will explain that perhaps in the discussion. So with this, just a couple of salient points in summary. So global trade turned out to be much more resilient, particularly agricultural trade. There's practically no discernible impact at the aggregate level. Of course, there are impacts localized for individual countries. And I stick out my head here, my neck here. I would even postulate that a second wave is also unlikely to have a major impact on global trade. Of course, there will be impacts that are more important for individual countries and commodities. And we've seen this, of course. We have seen disruptions in supply chains for fruits and vegetables, for meat, etc. But luckily, they were largely of a temporary nature. We are seeing currently something that's typical of crisis, and that's essentially an anti-Prebisch-Singer moment for agriculture. It's not for primary commodities in general, and I think there could be a longer-term change. And okay, so of course, not everything is rosy. Overall, food import bills remain largely unchanged, but we see a shift away from the more expensive goods to staples. So colloquially put, from the expensive calories to the cheap calories. There are a number of countries that are in severe difficulties in financing their food imports, and that's a combination of high debt burdens, devaluations, lower export revenues, lower growth. There are essentially half a dozen countries that are in sovereign debt default because of COVID, and that has severe impacts on their food security. And so that's a very worrisome trend, particularly for already food insecure countries in Africa. And with this, thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to responding to the questions.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this very detailed analysis. And thank you especially for the positive picture. Even though you made it clear that not everything has been that positive, but overall agricultural sector seems to have been impacted much less than we expected, and much less than maybe other goods. And you listed several reasons for them, such as demand inelasticity, but you also mentioned that because the supply chains were less complex. So maybe we have to get back to that point later with the questions. So I also picked up that the policy responses have been better than during the last crisis, which shows that actually we can learn the lessons from the previous crisis and implement them during the crisis after. So we will see what we learn from this crisis. So now moving from a broader picture to a more specific picture and exactly to a small island developing country like Jamaica. So Cheryl, maybe you can tell us from your perspective, from a government perspective, government of a small country, and we already saw from Joseph's presentation that you went through maybe through more difficulties than some others. So can you tell us more about the challenges you faced, the challenges the government faced, and what are some of the main lessons you learned from this crisis?
So thank you very much, Ula, and good afternoon, distinguished panelists and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. And I am also honored to have been asked to participate in this symposium. I will limit my presentation to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on agriculture, producers, governments, and also examples of government's intervention, as well as lessons learned from the pandemic. And indeed, Joseph identified in his very last slide, I believe, the percentage of food import bill, the issue of remittances percentage, tourism. So I think he has actually just set it up a little bit to some of the things that you'll hear from this presentation. The pandemic, as we know, and we have been saying, it's almost like a cliche now that it's the greatest global challenge of all time. And we have already seen the impact on the agriculture sector globally, but I'm afraid we do not yet have the data to say the extent to which that impact will be negative. I know Joseph has a very positive outlook, but when you hear some of the things that have happened to us, there are some regions, the small islands, who have had some experiences that have impacted us. Additionally, the lag effect, we believe, of the damage flowing from the pandemic will be a very long one, for many a very painful one, and especially to our small farmers and for net food importing countries such as Jamaica, also flagged by Joseph, where about 61% of our foods are imported. We can only hope that we do not relive the gravity of the impact we experienced during the last food crisis. I have noted, however, that there are opinions that COVID-19 could be worse. In fact, a survey done in the Caribbean by the FAO, the World Food Programme, the Caribbean Community Secretariat, and the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, SEDEMA, found that while 59% of respondents reported increased prices in April, the number is now high, was much higher in June at 79%. So let's look at producers. Disruptions in supply chains and value chains really have posed a real risk to the agriculture sector and global food systems. There has been a reduction in the movement of goods across borders, principally due to the disruptions in international logistics brought on by the closure of ports, airports, border crossings. And this has negatively affected agricultural trade, both as it relates to exports and imported inputs, such as farm tools, seeds, fertilizers, etc., for agricultural production. The WTO has concluded in a recent report that although the agriculture sector has been more resilient to the impact of the pandemic, and Joseph also brought that out, than other goods, there is a slowdown in global agricultural trade compared to the same period in 2019, and may have now entered negative growth. The virtual closure of the tourism sector, in addition to the lockdown measures on entertainment facilities, on restaurants, on schools, on marketplaces, and other similar venues, have resulted in a collapse of market opportunities for local agricultural producers, thereby resulting in a glut on the local market for several products. In Jamaica, for example, my own country, poultry farmers suffered quite a loss as they struggled to rid themselves of the highly perishable product, given that many of these farmers do not have large storage facilities to preserve surpluses. Measures such as restrictions on movements, social distancing policies, also led to a reduction in man hours on farms and a decline in the number of workers in small factories and agro-processing facilities. And these, of course, have led to slowed production. The same FAO, WFP, CARICOM, SEDEMA survey, which I mentioned earlier, found that most respondents have actually also change their diets from nearly 1/3 skipping meals, eating less, or going a day without eating. The survey also found that lockdown policies have also limited access to markets for consumers, which would impact market demand. Farmers who may have to acquire permits to cross provincial borders to sell their produce or reduce working hours due to curfew timing are among those most heavily hit, especially in countries with larger populations, as well as informal agriculture workers are now placed at additional risks in terms of income loss, social protection, and working conditions. To date, governments, including members of the OACPS, for which I am coordinator in Geneva, have felt the impact of COVID-19 in a number of ways. The biggest challenge, we believe, is the uncertainty as to when we will be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Allow me to just list a few examples of some of the impact, or especially on agriculture and agricultural trade. One, the slowdown in trade has led to a reduction in government revenue at the border. During the first wave of COVID-19, the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, did a sampling of 18 African countries and found out that they lost 24% of customs revenue in April 2020. That is approximately US 346 million. In many of our countries, as you would be aware, customs revenue make up a large percentage of government revenue. Reductions in goods and services trade and the economic fallout in trading partners due to COVID mean less intake of foreign currency, which in many cases created uncertainty in the local currency market in vulnerable developing countries. Foreign currency shortages also led to a slowed export and import activities as traders find difficulties acquiring foreign exchange to make international purchases. The projection by the UN WTO that tourism earnings will contract going into 2021 is not good news for countries such as ours, especially the countries of the Caribbean and the Pacific. The FAO has foreshadowed that the fall off in foreign exchange earnings will make it even more difficult for SIDS to import food, thereby exacerbating food availability in these countries. And Joseph also mentioned that in his presentation. Having previously mentioned the impact of restrictions on movements and social distancing on man hours and in the number of workers, factories, and agro-processing facilities, leading to slowed production, this has of course resulted in less government revenue. Increased unemployment led to some of the agricultural facilities being forced to close due to financial difficulties. And in addition, food security became sharply impacted due to slowdown in operations, export restrictions in major food exporting countries, and disruptions in logistics arrangements. Now, one of the things that has hit countries such as ours is limited capacity and resources constraints. And this has affected the extent to and the pace at which governments devise response to the crisis. We have seen international cooperation, though, becoming one of the policy tools being employed by governments to manage the impact of the pandemic. I will focus more on the Caribbean due to time constraints. So the Caribbean community launched the CARICOM COVID-19 Agri-Food Risk Management Framework and Action Plan to manage the risks posed to regional food systems, as well as to provide a guide for member states as to the possible approaches that can be taken to develop national operational plans to effectively respond to the food and nutrition security concerns which COVID might present. The plan proposes immediate to long-term actions to be taken by stakeholders, covering food availability and production, SPS measures, strengthening inter-regional trade in agriculture, digitalization, and financing of the sector. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative, it's important to note, which includes member states, the private sector, and regional and international development institutions. Responses under that initiative are invited into immediate actions such as engagement with development partners, monitoring intra-CARICOM transportation and logistics services, creation of a trade and information portal with the aim of linking excess production with food deficits throughout the region, interventions by the Caribbean Agriculture, Health and Food Safety Agency, especially as regards SPS measures and protocols, creation of a regional food import production monitoring mechanism as well as a longer real-time information on the potential for regional production of key food items and inputs. Longer-term actions include reducing dependence on food imports by improving food security. And this, as you can see, have come to the fore. This is done through inter alia promoting scientific and technological innovations across all aspects of the agriculture value chain, improving the ease of doing business to attract investments, improving regional logistics and transportation connectivity, etc. There's also the creation of an information and statistical system to support evidence-based decision-making. Other measures taken to manage the impact include temporary export restrictions to deal with surpluses, provision of fiscal stimulus programs to assist farmers to weather the impact of the pandemic, closure or reduction of operating hours at markets where farmers usually sell their produce, and provision of storage facilities to farmers who have perishable products. Finally, I would just like to conclude with a few lessons learned, and I know my time is there. The need to have rules in the WTO that can better prepare countries, better prepare its members for unforeseen shocks like the COVID pandemic has been brought to the fore. The importance of paying greater attention to e-commerce, especially as it relates to how best governments can assist local farmers to integrate with e-commerce platforms. The pandemic will be with us for a while, so we have to orient local farmers and producers to adapt their farming and production practices to these realities. A greater thrust towards economic diversification should be prioritized, we believe, especially for developing countries and LDCs, whose economies depend on a narrow range of products. The need to enhance dialogue regionally and internationally to ensure that food security systems are resilient to shocks such as this COVID-19 pandemic. The importance of improving equitable access to insurance policies for farmers and producers so that losses can be better accommodated in the future. Paying greater attention to making supply chains and logistics arrangements more resilient to unforeseen shocks. And finally, the need for more budgetary allocation by governments of developing countries and LDCs to facilitate more advanced and adaptable production and food security systems. I will stop there for the moment. I know there will be several questions to respond to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. Indeed, there were questions already coming in while you spoke. So thank you very much. So I think we all take note that, as I mentioned before, that there is a broad, relatively positive picture, but when we go into details, some smaller countries or some countries have been hit harder than others. And it seems that it's more from the economic impact, right? People losing jobs, people not going to be able to go to work, people not having money to buy food. And so it's an economic impact on the country. We also noted that it clearly has been given a boost to the regional cooperation. So something good will come out of it. So I'm sure maybe Joseph later will want to add some things to your presentation, and we will have the questions that came in for later. But now just to move on, moving from a small country to a big country and a big agricultural producer. So Claire, you represent the organization that represent a lot of different members. Your members are producers, processors, agri-food exporters, and if I understand correctly, 90% of Canadian farmers are your members. So you have a big diversity of members, but they have all one thing in common. They all depend on trade. So can you tell us, with all these different members, you must have seen very different concerns expressed by them, and have these concerns evolved during this year? So, and from your members' perspective, from the private sector perspective, what are some of the key lessons learned?
All right, well, thank you, and good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are on the planet. My name is Claire Cito, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, or CAFTA. It truly is an honor to be speaking with such an esteemed group of people who live and breathe global trade every day as we do. CAFTA is the voice of Canadian agri-food exporters, representing the major trade-dependent sectors in Canada, including beef, pork, meat, grains, cereals, pulses, soybean, canola, as well as the sugar, malt, and processed foods industries. The way I summarize it is more or less the entire Canadian ag sector, but the dairy and poultry sectors. So we represent about 90% of what Canada exports in terms of ag and food, which last year reached a record 60 billion. I'd like to take some time to talk about how our sectors experienced during the COVID crisis, what we learned and what we remain concerned about, and what we need the WTO to deliver on moving forward. And first off, I want to emphasize that it really deserves to be recognized just how foundational agri-food trade is for our economy and way of life in every corner of the globe. It's remarkable that with most of the world on lockdown, global agri-food markets have remained relatively stable. Here in Canada, of course, the impact of the crisis varies across sectors. And for our members, it's a bit of a mixed bag. For all, keeping the Canada-US border open to trade has been especially critical given the high level of integration of our supply chains across North America. Let me highlight a few perspectives from our members. For canola and grain farmers in Canada, the concern at the onset focused on market volatility, farmers' revenues, and whether crop inputs would be in place for seeding. With our short growing season, even small seeding delays can impact farmers' production and increase their exposure to risk. And without borders opened, things would have been quite different. COVID created a lot of uncertainty, adding to existing uncertainty from unjustified trade barriers. As such, today our members remain focused on more than ever on actions that ensure that trade commitments and trade rules are respected and that SPS measures are based on science. Our food manufacturers ramped up production by up to 500% at times, invested heavily to keep workers safe, retooled manufacturing facilities, and tried to hire more workers. There are real questions about the future of the industry, the restaurant industry. For food manufacturers who are looking to secondary sources to secure essential raw materials, ingredients, and packaging as they rebuild their inventories, they're now no longer relying on a single supplier. The diversification of their supply chains is becoming critical. And to that end, they need the WTO to ensure that international trade is based on rules and science-based and allow for the predictable flow of ingredients, products, and people. The pulse sector also faced major disruptions triggered by key export markets that imposed quarantine measures, adding delays in shipment clearance. And in cases, import bans were put in place to save on foreign exchange reserves. The lack of prior notice were particularly disrupting for shipments already en route. Another challenge also has been the lack of available shipping containers. The natural flow of inbound traffic of containers from Asia and shipped back on the backhaul has been severely disrupted. Government policies and actions should follow principles that recognize the interdependence of food producing regions and food deficit regions around the world. Also, new measures by government must recognize the impact on existing contracts and on products that are already en route to markets. On the meat side, processing capacity dipped below 50% of Canada's normal capacity when one of our major processing facilities closed, while others significantly reduced their capacity. The industry needed to face the challenges of working through the backlog of cattle and hog within the supply chain, as well as the market impact of uncertainty that had developed. And during this time, uninterrupted trade ensured very little market disruptions for the consumer side of the supply chain. Today, our meat exports are almost back to normal, and COVID was difficult to handle, of course, for the sector. But it also certainly showed the strength of the system, both within Canada and the responsiveness and dependability of international trade. Despite the crisis, those in the agri-food supply chain are a resilient bunch. For our members, the most serious concerns, though, really lie ahead. Because we're potentially waking up in a new trade world, one where governments seize on the pandemic for political posturing or to push a nationalist and protectionist agenda forward. The talk of self-sufficiency in food and nationalism is particularly concerning, as it will lead to a new form of protectionism. The unraveling is a big worry. Look at coal in Italy or SPS measures affecting our pulses in India and how easily they can spill over to other countries in the name of food security. With agri-food being one of the most vulnerable to protectionism, a tide of protectionism creeping under the cover of nationalism would be very difficult to unroll. We really must hold the line against protectionism in all its forms and in every corner of the globe. This, even with our closest trading partners. That's whether south of the border or on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's been over 3 years now that the EU-Canada trade deal came into force, and our exporters are growing increasingly frustrated with the EU's unwillingness to respect the spirit of the agreement and to remove trade barriers that are affecting our exports. Let's not have technical trade barriers stand in the way of our economic recovery. This is why we need an effective and enforceable rules-based global trading system. And at the top of the agenda for Canadian agri-food exporters, the need to ensure that international trade is preserved, enhanced, based on science and rules agreed upon to allow for the stable, predictable flow of ingredients, products, and people. This is why we fully support Canada's leadership at the WTO through the Ottawa Group to safeguard the WTO, the rules-based trading system, and literally to hold it together. It is crucial that Canada and its trading partners work together to keep borders open, unwind restrictions, foster transparency, double down on efforts to modernize the WTO, fix the appeal mechanism, and make real progress on notification, domestic support, export restrictions, among others. And I'd like to really underscore the importance of transparency. Countries have demonstrated during COVID an ability to share information and notifications of measures adopted in response to the crisis in relatively timely and transparent manner. Such practices should remain in place and be made permanent to increase the transparency and timeliness of notification for SPS and other measures, and should also include justifications for such measures and potential solutions to manage risks without blocking trade. Ultimately, COVID taught us that we can weather this storm, but the world needs more trade, not less, but we also need better trade. Fortunately, managing logistics and adapting quickly to market needs is a core strength of our members. Unfortunately, trade rules do not adapt quickly. This is all the more important to have rules that are predictable and based on science. Overall, we've seen markets show an increased willingness to disregard the WTO obligations in order to protect their own interests at any cost. This started before the crisis, but certainly COVID made it worse. Part of the problem is that these actions have become more acceptable with the impression of a weakened WTO. The advancements of WTO reforms, the adaptation of WTO rules to fit the changing global landscape, and adherence by members to these rules is really imperative. And it boils down to better dialogue, transparency, nimbleness, and bold approaches, and genuine commitment to resolve the challenges that we face. We need to break down the silos that exist between governments, international organizations, and industry, so we don't fight fires, but prevent them. That includes shortening the distance between Geneva and the farms, the ranches, food manufacturing facilities, and the broader public who are impacted. In North America, certainly the renegotiation of NAFTA serves as the wake-up call, and it showed just how valuable it is for government and industry to talk up together the value of trade and how the tide lifts all boats. The current crisis gives us a chance to get ambitious, put forward bold proposals, and secure the promise our sectors hold for powering forward the post-pandemic global recovery. It is time to recognize the central role of international trade for the future of the agri-food sector. Over the next 20 to 30 years, the global demand for agri-food products will continue to grow rapidly, and agri-food trade can certainly fuel prosperity and continue to feed families in every corner of the globe. But that is provided we aggressively oppose protectionism and spend the political capital necessary to keep trade free and open. and finally move forward in a meaningful way on trade liberalization in agriculture at the WTO. These are the opportunities we must seize, and we stand ready to do our part. And we also look forward to working with you all to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. So if the way I understood your points from my personal perspective is that even during the crisis, it looks like unpredictability of measures was a bigger problem than the measures themselves. Of course, the measures impacted too, but just not to know what will happen when you need to sell or export. That seemed to be a big problem. And the other challenge seems to have that is still there for your members is not that much the COVID or the second wave that you fear, but rather the measures by your trading partners. So, and we obviously took note of more trade and more cooperation. So it's all music to our ears. So let me now move on to a broader perspective back. So we looked at the small country problems, big country issues, and now we look at the OECD views. Yeah, and OECD has been monitoring very closely the evolution of agricultural trade and also of COVID and the impact of COVID on the sector. So building on your experience and what the other panelists have just said, the question we all would like to have an answer to is what next? Where are we heading now? What are the key takeaways and what are the things we should pay attention to moving forward?
Thanks, Ula, and thanks for the invitation to be with you all today. It's really a pleasure and great to be on this panel following the remarks from these three other speakers who all of them raised issues that I will also touch on in my talk. So that makes me feel like we're all kind of converging on a vision of what's going on and what we can think about in terms of opportunities going forward, moving off of COVID. So the bulk of my talk will focus on policies and what policy makers can do to contribute to solutions. But I just wanted to highlight a few things that I picked up listening to remarks and from our monitoring work that we do at the OECD. So first of all, it's clear that the COVID pandemic accelerated already existing trends. So we've seen massive upticks in adoption of digital tools. Obviously, teleworking has become the normal, but we've also seen a drift back towards nationalist policies. And we heard remarks from Claire just now really reinforcing that as a concern. But as Joseph mentioned, we've also seen that markets and trade have been working. So global value chains in general have been robust and resilient. And arguably this is because in the agriculture sector, firms and producers are used to having to manage risk. So they're thinking about risks. And when we had some consultations with private sector stakeholders, this came out time and time again, that firms, because agriculture is dependent on weather, for example, they're thinking to the future and trying to troubleshoot even before something happens. So COVID was a big disruption, but many of the firms and producers that we consulted with noted that they had been thinking about disruptions and what they would do to keep the value chains moving. Joseph also stressed in his presentation quite effectively that ag trade has been resilient, and we have also observed that through our monitoring, and all three of you have mentioned issues around transparency. So obviously transparency is really key in terms of making the whole system work, because I think even Ula mentioned it, wrapping up from Claire's talk, more information is beneficial to everyone. And when it comes down to coordinating in some situations like COVID, which is such a massive disruption with unexpected changes, it can only benefit the whole system if stakeholders are sharing information. So the WTO has a great role there in terms of making sure that members know what's going on in terms of policy changes. And we also know that FAO and the AMIS platform have contributed, for example, in terms of coordinating information about measures like export restrictions in the agricultural commodity sector. Before getting into the policies, just a couple of notes on what we learned from firms. So the private sector is contributing to resilience of value chains, and they do this through efforts to anticipate the way shocks will affect their supply chains. And they have different kinds of tools. They'll do foresight analysis, which is helps predict how their existing structures might react to different kinds of disruptions. And they do stress testing to make sure that they can sort of future-proof their strategies for the coming years in terms of their value chain development. These kinds of tools can help identify new opportunities and also identify where the challenges will be. And they can help, if firms are communicating with the public sector, they can help designing innovative and forward-looking actions and strategies. We've also seen an uptick in digital analytics. So firms, for example, in the case of COVID, there was such a massive demand shock where consumers, when the lockdown measures went in place, moved off of consuming through restaurants, for example, and moved back to consuming at home. Massive disruptions in terms of how some of the firms in a value chain could think about where their markets were. And digital tools helped. They helped in identifying where the demand tools were moving, and they helped identify trends so that firms can be thinking about what their future strategies should be. And the last thing to notice is that many of the firms we spoke with also were quite clear that it was important to keep the dialogue going between the private sector and the public sector. And this picks up on themes that we've already heard through the three other speakers. This kind of cooperation can help with coordination for things like what is the definition of an essential good. We knew that food, for example, would be identified as an essential good early on, but what about inputs for agricultural production? What about fertilizer and seeds? Would those also be identified as essential? So if the private sector was effective in making sure those kinds of inputs could also be identified as essential, that means that our food supply chain is going to be more robust. And we've seen those kinds of efforts along the way. So then I wanted to pick up the main point, which is what can governments do to contribute to solutions? So we have three categories of advice. So the first is governments can avoid making things worse. The second is they can make efforts to remove disincentives for firms to actually adopt more resilient supply chain measures. And the third is they can redirect their support to invest in longer term goals for the sector, longer term productivity, sustainability, and resilience goals in the sector. So I'll just go through each of those three. The first one, governments can avoid making things worse. They can avoid the category of measures that people sometimes call beggar thy neighbor measures. And Claire mentioned this in her presentation. Sometimes there can be, when one country starts implementing protectionist measures, that creates the incentive for their trading partners to implement the same. And we were fortunate in this year that we didn't see the same situation that we had during the food price crisis a decade or more ago, where there was a cascade of export restrictions, which exacerbated the food security situation rather than contributing to a solution. So these kinds of measures dilute trust, and that dilutes the trust in your trading partners, but also in trade and market as tools to navigate this crisis. The second category to think about is what can governments do to remove disincentives towards more resilient supply chains. So the OECD runs an annual monitoring exercise, and what we've seen this year, before we introduced our monitoring on COVID, so just thinking about the period of time, the past 3 years, that across the 54 countries that OECD monitors, more than 700 billion US dollars was provided in terms of support to agriculture during that period. And half of it came in the form of market price support or trade distorting support and policies that can tend towards being more environmentally harmful. When we added in monitoring to look at what was going on with COVID policies, we had an inventory of about 500 measures in the agricultural and food sector. And those measures really varied across countries. We saw sector-wide measures related to health. We had measures related to making sure information was available both to consumers and producers to decrease incentives for stockpiling. There were trade interventions that we've already heard in this panel, labor interventions, and safety nets and food assistance. We observed that developed countries were using more agricultural or support-related measures in this context of COVID, and emerging economies were more focused on using trade policies and trade facilitation measures to make sure that food and agricultural products could move across borders effectively, even during this time of disruption. In terms of quantifying that, we observed that at least 47 billion US dollars was allocated by OECD governments to the agricultural and food sector during this period up till May. And about a third of those reported measures were urgent and considered necessary sort of time-sensitive interventions, but about 2/3 of them look like they could be support for measures that would decrease or challenge the resilience of the sector. We also saw that countries and firms were moving towards more digital tools for border processes, especially in the area of SPS certifications. So we have measured a big uptake in terms of digital certification, which helped manage some of the risks associated with paper and the sort of intense need of having people passing paper to each other and coming in close contact. So the digital tools remove that need to have the up-close person contact. The third category, so the first two categories were don't do anything to make things worse. The second category was reinvest or remove disincentives to a more resilient supply. The third category is that governments can think about is redirecting support to invest in long-term objectives, because the risk is in this moment of crisis, firms or countries make interventions that are short-term focused, when actually what we need is a long-term focus in agriculture. We need investments in people in terms of skills so that firms and producers are able to adapt to a changing world and new kinds of risks. We need investments in innovation, like research and development, again, to try to make sure that the sector is able to adapt to the rapidly changing climate conditions, for example. And we need investments in infrastructure. And we heard a couple of the speakers mention this too. We need investments in storage. We need investments in internet connection and e-commerce platforms. And there's lots more opportunities for public and private cooperation. We've heard great examples from Cheryl about this category, and it can only help to have the communication between those stakeholders, among the private sector and then between the private sector and the public sector, especially again in these contexts of disruption, because in order to make sure that the interventions are actually fit for purpose, the public sector needs to know what the private sector is experiencing, and the private sector needs to know what they can hope for from the public sector. And then finally, I just want to wrap up, like we've already heard previous speakers, noting that in this context, with this massive disruption, there's an even more urgent need to make sure that we're addressing trade distorting measures, which really reinforces the comments that we've heard about reinvigorating conversations and negotiations at the WTO. It's encouraging to see that there's been some conversations about export restrictions, including coming back to this idea that foodstuffs purchased for humanitarian purposes by the World Food Program would be not possible to use export restrictions on those products. It's also important that we think about the complexity of policies in the agri-food sector. So what are you thinking of the agriculture sector as a means of providing livelihoods, of a means of providing healthy and nutritious food for everyone, as a means of ensuring sustainable use of natural resources, all those things together maybe, and there's going to be trade-offs across those categories of objectives for the sector. So it's important in terms of having discussions about what we could do to reinvigorate the rules and make sure that the rules are fit for the situation that we're in currently, that we think about those kinds of synergies and trade-offs. And finally, it's important that we continue the focus at the WTO on forward-looking measures for the sector. So again, just to reinforce the point, investments in innovation, investments in people, investments in infrastructure, all that kind of support can help make sure that the ag sector is resilient and sustainable and productive into the future. So this year is giving us lots of challenges, but it's also creating opportunities for us to take steps to transform the agricultural food sector so that it's resilient into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leah. And I think we heard your messages loud and clear. Do no harm, invest wisely, and obviously transparency is very important, and obviously support to your producers, make the difference between short-term and long-term, because obviously there's a risk that we are focused on the short-term objective while we have to keep in mind also the long-term objectives. So just quickly, before we move, we have several questions from our viewers. But just to point out, because the one thing when I listen to all our panelists, the difference where I see, you probably seem to agree on everything, but on the supply chains. So I heard that there's a diversification of supply chains taking place. I heard that there is the supply chains, we need to bring them closer home. And I heard also that agricultural supply chains being simpler than others actually help the agricultural sector, agricultural trade. So what is anybody who would like to address that question? What are we supposed to do then with the supply chain? Bring them home, keep them where they are, diversify, or is there one size fits all solution to it? Anybody who would like to go ahead on that one? Yes, Leon, please go.
I can hop in on this. Just quickly to react to your, is there a one size fits all question? Clearly, in terms of specifics, there's not a one size fits all in the agriculture sector. There's so much diversity, as we know, even listening to our panelists. And there will always be trade-offs in terms of measures that we implement for the agri-food sector, but trade can be part of the solution. The OECD has done some modeling exercises to show what happens when countries nationalize or put in measures to seek to nationalize their agri-food supply chains. And what we've seen is that if you have fewer trade channels can decrease the shocks that are observed in the market, but it also creates a bigger adjustment burden on domestic markets. It decreases production typically, which ends up increasing prices for consumers, you know, the kind of policies that we were looking at in that model were things that were breaking the linkages along the supply chain for key inputs like agri-food, fertilizer, animal feed, and seeds. So again, the outcome is that there's a big burden on domestic producers and consumers if you implement those kinds of measures.
Yes, I think there is Claire who would like to say something, and then Joseph.
Sure, thank you. I think one of the most important lessons from COVID is that we need to manage risks and not avoid them. For farmers and food manufacturers and exporters. Risk is everywhere in agri-food, and managing risk is a core competency for them. Resilience really is about having suppliers who can shift to supply a market with a little costs. Unfortunately, when countries adopt different rules around various measures that affect trade or SPS measures, plant breeding, crop protection products, and so forth, the ability to shift products from one destination to another, or the ability to adapt to market changes, is what makes it difficult for our exporters. So really, we need the WTO to really help countries not only maintain predictable science-based rules, but also update them so they continue to be based on science, enforceable, and we need also that transparency so that countries can proactively engage to prevent emerging non-tariff barriers from being forced again, so that we can prevent fires and not fight them.
Thank you, Claire. Joseph?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the re-regionalization or relocalization of supply chains. I think it would be really a mistake. And one of the reasons why the system was so resilient was actually because the supply chains remained internationally, remained open, and they even afforded developing countries with new opportunities to enter markets. Just a couple of examples. When the citrus supply chains were on the brink of collapsing in Europe, it afforded a great opportunity to Egypt to enter the market in an off-season period, and Egypt certainly benefited from having the opportunity of exporting more citrus to Europe. And I think that stabilized the situation in Europe and certainly was a beneficial development for Egypt. The same for Kenya. Kenya managed to export more fruits and vegetables, and certainly to the advantage of Europe as well as the advantage of Kenya. So, and the same holds for many other countries, and including, and that's why I emphasize African countries, including for African countries, countries that depend on agricultural exports for their export earnings and eventually for their food security. So I think the worst thing that could happen is if we were really to embark on a re-regionalization or relocalization of supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have much time left, so I would like to, would you like to say something, Clara?
No, well, yes, I just wanted to chime in on the supply chain issue, and as Joseph just amplified about the importance of keeping them open, and as much as possible, if incentivize use of it. I think it's very important. One of the things that we are looking at as well is how do we factor decent work commitments of governments in that context, and that is something I guess we are constantly raising nowadays. The other issue is the resilience, and I believe Claire mentioned the whole issue of resilience and management of risk. And the last thing I would mention is the whole issue of accessibility to MISNIs. Perhaps, I don't know if perhaps we'll have time for Joseph to perhaps, I don't know if he has done any, looked at that, but I think the whole issue of medium size and small, medium size enterprises in this context is critical. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I keep my eye on the clock. There are a few questions. I just opened them that are directly to Cheryl. One is from Dominica, from Julian, who is, it's more rather a comment than a question that says that Dominica, the impact on Dominica food supply was rather minimal due to some policies in place, including import substitution and so on. So this question more points out that the situation is slightly different. It looks like the biggest impact on supply chains was in the tourism sector, and it was more to point out that there is the different situation with Jamaica as as a country. So I don't know if you care to comment on that one. And then there is another one, we don't have the name of the person, who is also asked about, because Cheryl, you mentioned about the lost revenues. So the question is about the importance of international trade for state revenues in CARICOM countries and the need for policy space to help these countries navigate through trade and economic shocks. So what lessons regarding the policy space for the agricultural sector can be drawn from the current crisis that could influence current discussions on capping and reduction of trade distorting domestic support that would lead to fairer, more transparent, predictable, resilient agricultural trading system? To say that we didn't want to get into negotiations, but here we are. What policy space is there? Do you have enough policy space, or what does it tell, the fact that now there was this impact on revenues?
Ula, I will just touch on the question from Dominica now. I think I will just read the other one because it's a little bit long and I didn't capture everything. But just to point out that the presentation, if you would notice, wasn't an emphasis on Jamaica at all. In fact, it was the regional approach. I did flag, just because Joseph had some good statistics, I did from time to time refer to some of that. But it's really what we are doing as a region to deal with the issue of regional food systems and the risk posed to our food security. So that's the only comment I would make in terms of that comment from the representative of Dominica. I will just have a read of the other question and get back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. I have few other questions. One I have to pick because we probably can't address them all. One from Hilton in South Africa is about cotton farmers. And given that the cotton farmers have suffered a lot, I'm not reading out the full question, but in short, it's whether these farmers should try and whether the COVID-19 storm and stick with cotton production, or should they rather attempt to switch from fiber production to food production, even if that is on a subsistence basis and or at lower financial returns. That goes back to the point made before that the different products, while agriculture trade maybe suffered less, there were some products who suffered more. So now these poor producers, what should they do? They should just give up and move to produce something else or stick to it. Naturally, yes, Joseph, so I thought.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to get into the specifics of cotton and fibers versus food, but I think it's very important that a farmer has a long-term goal, not a very short-term picture that is driving his investment decisions. And the same holds for government. So it's important to have a long-term idea as to where development should go to, both on the farm and on a country. And actually, governments made considerable mistakes in the past, and so did international organizations advising governments. And so it's really also mea culpa. If you think of the crisis we had in 2007, 2008, everybody jumped onto the bandwagon and said, yes, we need to have more production. We have to subsidize fertilizers. We have to do all sorts of things to stimulate production in the short run. Farmers are, of course, quick. They immediately jump on new opportunities. As prices went up, they did all this. So if governments, in addition, say, try to do this, there are two problems. The first is typically they are slow. They are always behind the private sector. So it may eventually lead to a situation where farmers have already invested and then governments come and say, we invest in addition into all sorts of things. And then as farmers invest and farmers produce more, prices normalize. And if then at that stage the government comes in, prices fall actually too strongly. And that's what we actually observed in 2007, 2008, and with prices plunging in 2009, and then again seen a strong uptick. So it's very easy to actually exacerbate swings if the timing, pacing, and sequencing of these measures is not well done. So the idea is, and that's what Leanne very eloquently put forward, is essentially to have a longer term goal and invest in things that create resilience, like infrastructure, digitalization, skills, etc. And that's my recommendation to the cotton farmer in South Africa. I would not look at the price ticker every day, but try to understand where the longer term opportunities are and prepare the farm in a way that allows the farmer to actually reap the benefits of a certain trend that is underway. South Africa, by the way, in terms of fruits and vegetables exports, for instance, did extremely well. So if that is a possibility, I don't think that this will be a market that is slowing down. It's the fastest growing market of all agricultural markets. And I think that would be a perfect opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, it's about agricultural migrant and seasonal workers. So basically they couldn't come to work because of lockdown measures and so on. So the question is, would they be able to return to their jobs in the next agricultural season, or will their task have been replaced in whole or part by mechanization of workers from the work providing country that have been rendered unemployed in other sectors? So basically, will they find their jobs, or they've been replaced and some changes are there to stay? Joseph?
Yeah, okay. I think they will come back. In the vast majority of the cases, they will come back. The investments in robotics, in all sorts of machinery that allows farmers to harvest, to seed, to do all sorts of things in labor-intensive industries like fruits and vegetables is something that will take place over the longer term. In the short term, I would not see any major threat. So given the fact that we have a number of vaccines available now in the market, I would be very positive that this happens. So, and we are seeing this already, so I'm not worried. Perhaps there's one point that perhaps needs to be emphasized. What the crisis brought to the fore, and Cheryl mentioned this as well, was that we need to pay more attention to decent work, to occupational health and safety standards, and that certainly came out in the abattoir industry, in the meat processing industry. So the situation as we witnessed there, it seems to be a universal problem and a very severe one. And I think it would be very important that policymakers going forward are ensuring that minimal occupational health and safety standards are being observed in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Maybe Claire, there is a question, what has changed forever? Is there anything that has changed forever due to that crisis for your members?
Perhaps it's too premature to tell, but certainly there are some lessons learned, in particular on the importance of the need for unfettered trade and being more proactive in terms of anticipating what non-tariff barriers might arise and disrupt the supply chains.
Thank you, and we are really reaching the end, but one quick question for Leanne, given that you have done some forward-looking analysis. So what are the main risks for the food security now? Is it the second wave, even though we had good news on the vaccine today? Or is it, what is it? What are the main risks for the food security looking forward?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in the analysis that we've done is that the risks for food security are really mostly related to the income shocks that are obvious from the disruptions this year. It has much less to do with agricultural production, but it's really important to keep an eye on what the pandemic is going to mean for access to food. there are some hotspots to keep in mind. So we know that, for example, that fragile and conflict-affected states would have more difficulty getting food due to logistics and disruptions to logistics, and also more difficulty managing some of the social distancing rules and health measures. But also there are countries that are facing multiple crises, including the pandemic, but maybe extreme weather events or pests coming in this year. And finally, we just have to keep an eye on poor and vulnerable populations around the world, because this pandemic is going to have income effects for people, and that's where the food security risks lie.
Thank you very much. Being aware of the time, and my apologies to Eric, who is going to moderate the session just after, I would like to take just 1 minute from the next session. Is just if you could quickly in one sentence say for you, what is the key lesson learned or to be learned from this crisis? What would it be? Each of you.
I can go first. Yeah, that's fine. For me, it's really important that we invest in creating habits of dialogue, because it's only through those kinds of behaviors and interactions that we're going to build trust and make sure that we have transparency in markets, so that we know how to coordinate and cooperate when the next unexpected event occurs.
Thank you, Leon. Joseph, I see you have microphone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my advice is use the crisis periods, as we probably have as of next year, and prepare for the long term. Steer clear of any knee-jerk measures. Have some long-term goals in mind, and it's clear for developing countries. They want to increase their productivity. They want to improve their infrastructure. They want to ensure their food security. And the same holds for developed countries in a different set of objectives. So it's clear that they should prepare for resilience. That is not something that can be done in 1 year. That's a longer term development. And the SDGs actually provide a good overall framework for that. Over.
Thank you. I saw Claire, but Claire, are you there? Well, then she was there and she disappeared. So Cheryl, you will have the final word.
My word is no man is an island, and it's important to just keep markets open, keep dialogue going, be transparent, be predictable, and ensure that whatever decisions you take does not create another crisis.
So thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to our viewers. Thank you to the technical team behind. I will have to ask you, the panelists, to switch off the microphones and cameras now. And dear viewers, you can stay for the next session that is starting now. It will be moderated by my colleague, Eric Wikström, and it will be on agriculture, trade, and nutritional diversity. So looking forward to seeing to all of you soon, and over to Eric.
Thank you very much, Ulla. Thank you for passing the baton on to me. I will wait a little while to see that my panelists come online with their video. So I would ask them to turn on their video so that I see you. Okay, I think I see you all. I see Francesco, yeah, and Marie, I see you too. Dirk, Chris.
I need help from that
to put
side.
on your video. Okay, I'll wait a few more seconds. There we go. Okay, now we have the whole panel there. So I think we will start more or less right on time. Just to remind those who are coming in now and who haven't been following before, this is the virtual WTO Agriculture Symposium on Trade and Food Systems Transformation. This particular panel that we are going to discuss now is the session 3, which is focused on nutrition and nutrition diversity. My name is Eric Wikström. I work for the Trade and Environment Division in the WTO, although I do have some past on the agriculture side, so I have been pulled in. But my area is standards and regulations, and I head the team in WTO on TBT. So I'll be moderating this. It's a pleasure to see you all there. Before I introduce you, just a quick word on what we are going to talk about here. This is really quite a complicated field. Of course, all issues we have talked about today have been complicated and complex, but I find this one particularly tricky. It's full of imbalances and contradictions. On the one hand, we have in the world today both hunger, starvation, and malnutrition, and that is too little food or food of bad quality. But on the other hand, there is some places too much food, perhaps, or too much of the wrong food. And there are problems with overweight and obesity. Some countries have even characterized their situations as epidemics, and they have serious health consequences. So how do we come to grip with these imbalances is something we will try to speak about now. And of course, it's not the responsibility of one organization, even one ministry, or even one set of policies. Rather, probably several organizations are going to be involved. That's why we have several of you here. It's a preoccupation for almost all governments, I would say all governments, the private sector, but also us individually, all of us as consumers. We all need to speak and to coordinate among each others. So in a way, this reminds me a little bit to the theme of environment in the Trade and Environment Division, that it's a cross-cutting topic and comes across very many areas of policy. So what I'd like to do, jumping right into it, is that I thought we could try to unpack this rather complex discussion into three areas. So we would look at the challenges. We start with that. What are the key challenges that we face today, globally, and within certain regions? Secondly, what does trade have to do with it? How do we look at trade? And thirdly, policy. So those three areas, challenge, trade, and policy. We have five speakers here in the panel. I welcome you again. We have Francesco Branca, who is a director. Maybe you can put your hand up so everyone sees. Oh, well, you see the name, of course, on Zoom. But Francesco Branca is director of the Department of Nutrition and Food Safety at the WHO, so here in Geneva. We have Namukolo Kovic, who is a senior research coordinator at the Agriculture for Nutrition and Health and International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, based in Ethiopia, but I think speaking with us today from South Africa. Then we have Chris Hagedorn, who is secretary of the Committee on World Food Security, based in Rome. And then we have Dirk Jacobs, who is both the Deputy Director General and Director of Consumer Information, Nutrition and Health on Food Drinks Europe, so a representative from the private sector. And then we have, last but not least, Anne-Marie Tho, who is Associate Professor at Public Policy and Health at the University of Sydney, and who will have the hardest time staying awake because it's the latest, I think, for all of us speaking here. So thank you all for being with us. I'd like for this to be informal, interactive. I refer to you by your first names. You do the same with me. For those of you who have questions, who would like to intervene, if you're watching this through the Zoom, if you're registered through Zoom, you can ask questions, but please use the Q&A format, not the chat. Those of you who are watching through the YouTube live stream, you need to register through the Zoom channel to be able to ask the questions, but you can't do so that way. We will try to, with my colleagues, try to take care of those questions and field them if we have time. So with all that, let's get started. And with this, I'd like to begin first with the challenges and to give some background, perhaps a canvas in terms of what we are looking at. What is a challenge? Why does this matter today? And Francesco, let me begin with you. Could you give us generally some fact and figures, globally, what the numbers are on hunger and malnutrition, obesity, and waste? How do you see this? Please go
Sure.
ahead.
Eric, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in a sense, a slightly different constituency that we are accustomed to speaking to. So to me, the main point is that the world is burdened by multiple forms of malnutrition. So let me give you some numbers. In 2019, we estimate that approximately 690 million adults worldwide were food insecure, which is about 1 in 10 people living in the world. And it's a growing number. Then looking at undernutrition, and we have a set of parameters to identify the main forms of malnutrition. We've estimated that, again, in 2019, about 144 million children under the age of 5 were stunted or affected by growth failure. And this is important because this is a condition that stays there. It affects human capacity, human capital. And then we had also 47 million children wasted, too thin for their height. And this is a condition which is a high risk of mortality. About 45% of the children's death are actually accounted for by undernutrition. And most of those children live in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. But at the same time, 38 million children under 5 years of age were overweight or obese. And since 2000, the prevalence of obesity has been increasing in all age groups. In the young children under 5, from 5 to 6%, it seems not too much, but it's actually quite a lot. In older children, 5 to 19 years, it has more than doubled. It went from 3% in 2000 to about 7% in 2016. And in among adults, obesity has increased 1.5 times, so that there's now more than 600 million people with obesity. But what is important that these multiple forms of malnutrition can exist in parallel, or same person can go through different stages throughout the life course. So you can have a coexistence of these forms of malnutrition at the individual, household, or population level. We calculated over a third of the population is affected by multiple forms of malnutrition simultaneously, but increasingly so in low and middle income countries. Now, what is the impact on health? We've calculated that 11 million deaths are attributable to dietary risk factors. And additional 8 million deaths are attributed to different forms of malnutrition. So altogether, it's about 20% of global burden of disease, which is accounted for by unhealthy diet and malnutrition. Now, looking specifically into unhealthy diet, we have high intake of sodium, which is a top one, but also low intake of some other things. So low intake of whole grains, low intake of fruits. Those are the leading risk factors for deaths and disability related to diet. And unhealthy diets have been growing as a determinant. So we had 8 million in 1990 and now 11 million deaths in 2017. The big problem is that unhealthy diet is not affordable. And the recent State of Food Security and Nutrition report has calculated that approximately 3 billion people, almost half of humanity, that does not have access to unhealthy diet. So that's where we are with the problem.
Okay, thank you. That is quite shocking in a sense what you're saying, especially the figure on 1 in 10 in 2019, probably no different today, being food insecure. And also the fact that healthy diets are not necessarily affordable. That's something I think perhaps might not be obvious to many. Can I just pick you on one particular issue, coming back to you, Francesco, on the terminology, because previously during the day, there's been a lot of talk about food security in general. How would you, here, of course, I see that as a very broad term, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that could include also issues of availability of food, access to food, stability of access to food, etc. And within this, you have the issue of health, or the term of quality of food and nutrition. Is that a correct way of seeing it?
Sure. I mean, food security refers to an adequate access to food sufficient to cover the energy needs for a healthy and an active life. We're also expanding a little bit this concept of food security to consider the quality of the diet. That we don't only cover the energy needs, but we cover the needs of all essential nutrients, so vitamins, mineral, certain fatty acids. So that's food security. We also have to consider food safety, which refers to the absence of harmful substances or microorganisms in food. And then we are using, this concept of food system. And, not everybody agrees on the concept, but let's say it's a broad concept that encompasses the actors and the processes related to the primary production, manufacturing, and distribution of foods, or what we call the food supply chains. But are also considering the determinants of the availability, economic access, and desirability of food environments, as well as the behavior of consumers and the broad socioeconomic and political drivers of those elements. Nutrition is the impact on the body, the impact on health. So nutrition, or actually we should say nutritional status, is related to the condition of the human body. An individual has a good nutritional status if she or he has a healthy growth and a healthy body composition, so the lean and fat mass, which is associated to optimal health and physical performance. And nutrition is influenced by diet, but is also influenced by physical activity and the occurrence of disease. So when you say malnutrition, it can take many forms. It can be, impaired linear growth, you don't grow, child doesn't grow, inadequate muscle or fat development, inadequate levels of vitamins and minerals, too much fat, overweight, and then beyond a certain level of obesity. So these are the different concepts you are using.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. Could I move then to Namukolo? You're doing research and have done research on the topic of nutrition and health, particularly in Africa for some time now. When we spoke in setting up this discussion, you mentioned that the African continent is at the crossroads with respect to nutrition. There are high levels of hunger, but also increasing levels of overweight, also in Africa. Could you paint this picture for us? Could you give us a little bit of an idea of the risks and opportunities on the African continent, please? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Eric. So we are facing high levels of undernutrition, and this is most visible in having 29% of under 5 children who are stunted that Francesca referred to. These children are not growing well, and this also has negative consequences on their cognitive development as well. Then they will also face a high likelihood of becoming overweight in adulthood just because of this condition in childhood. We do have 5% of the children who are wasted on the continent, the ones that weigh too little for their height. And these children face the risk of death without appropriate intervention in time. But while we are grappling with these examples of undernutrition, which also include micronutrient deficiencies, we are also experiencing increasing levels of overweight and obesity. And currently, all of the 54 African countries on the continent are on a trajectory to increasing levels of overweight and obesity without exception. So really, it's quite a situation. And this is why I refer to a crossroad. More specifically, if we look at, for example, adult women, what we are finding is that on the continent, we have increased the amount of overweight women from 31 to 41% between the years 2000 and 2016. Now, for some countries, this is even worse. So when we look at South Africa within the same period, between 2000 and 2016, in 2000, there were 56% of overweight women in South Africa. And we thought that was bad. But this increased to 65% in 2016 and is likely to have gotten even higher now. Francesca did allude to the fact that malnutrition is also related to health problems. What we are already beginning to see is that the prevalence of raised blood glucose, that's high blood sugar, is actually going up, and it has increased from 6 to 8% between 1999 and 2015. And if we compare this to North America, during the same period, it remained more steady, around 6%. This is a challenge because this is really a risk factor for developing diabetes. And it is happening in Africa, where our health facilities are actually quite limited. And indeed, the Global Burden of Disease report in 2017 did show that there is a higher likelihood of dying from conditions like diabetes on the African continent, simply because the health systems are more limited. Now, really, so yes, we are indeed on a crossroad. For those countries that have not yet swung the pendulum towards high prevalence of overweight and obesity and are still having more higher levels of underweight or stunting for children, the thing is, can we transform our food systems in such a way that they do not make that transition? And this is the crossroad that I am referring to. And so as we set off with these deliberations, especially as we move towards the UN Food Systems Summit, we should be asking ourselves to say, we do actually have a unique opportunity in that, for the most part, for most countries, the food processing industry is really at infancy. And so as we begin to develop our food processing industry, can we learn from elsewhere in the world and do things differently so that we do not end up with the same kind of situation of high salt, high fats, high sugar intake? That is the crossroad that I am referring to, that we are swinging from undernutrition to overweight, obesity, and related diet-related diseases. And our food system is transforming, but can we do things differently to transform in a more positive direction for nutrition and health? Thank you.
Thank you so much for putting that forward so clearly, particularly this point on that basically all the African countries are going towards increasing levels of overweight and perhaps even obesity. You mentioned sugar and diabetes and the fact that health systems may not be able to cope with them in Africa as they have in other parts of the world, which makes this more of a risk. But you also talked about opportunity. Can you learn from elsewhere? And we'll come back to that in the second and third rounds. But thank you, Namonkolo. Chris, can we move to you? You are the Secretary of the Committee on World Food Security in Rome. And I understand that you're currently working to develop some voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. So in developing these guidelines, without going into too much detail on the process itself, but I mean, what is the challenge that you are facing there? Over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and appreciate the invite, particularly with such a great cadre here of experts with whom I'm speaking. So yes, I'm Chris Hagedorn, Secretary of the CFS, based in Rome, hosted by the UN FAO. And perhaps some of you don't know what CFS is. We were set up as a committee of FAO in '74 and reformed in 2009 during a food crisis. In fact, '74 at the creation was a global food crisis. 2009 was yet another. And the CFS was reformed in 2009 along with the 2009 summit, resulting in a CFS that now includes non-state actors and constituencies, including private sector, civil society, various UN agencies, under a single tent to address the very complex issues around food and hunger. Our work is informed by the expert input from a 15-member high-level panel of experts, which is currently led by Dr. Martin Cole. And this was another key aspect of the CFS's reform. So many of you probably are aware of the CFS voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, dealing with land, forestry, and fisheries, the RIE principles on responsible ag investment, and possibly the voluntary guidelines on the progressive realization of the right to food. We also have more than a dozen policy recommendations on things like water, climate, gender, and livestock, to name just a few. So as Eric said, we are in the process, we're almost done, in fact, negotiating voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, which are expected to be adopted at the CFS 47 plenary session between 8 and 11 February. Hope you're all able to join us. Now, these voluntary guidelines have been a process underway for about 4 years, starting with members deciding that it should be a priority, then asking the CFS high-level panel of experts to prepare a report, number 12, which was drafted by an expert team led by Dr. Jessica Fonzo at Johns Hopkins University. Now, this report identified all the major issues at play, offered a basis for the current text, which is under negotiation at the moment. Of course, the voluntary guidelines will strive to address the nexus of issues between food production, i.e. calories, the impacts of human health, including the triple burden, obesity, the NCDs that were mentioned by Francesco, and of course, environmental sustainability. Are we able to produce food, sufficient, affordable food in a way that does not exceed environmental and planetary boundaries? So what are those challenges? There are many, and maybe I just simply start with COVID-19 complicating, certainly delaying the process by which we could begin negotiations. Meeting in person, obviously, is such a better option when you're negotiating text, and we've had to learn to adopt to a virtual Zoom environment. But the topics themselves are incredibly complex. And if you haven't read report number 12 by the CFS HLPE, highly recommend you do. Extremely well done. But the key issue here is only recently is the international community prepared essentially to deal with hunger and malnutrition together with health concerns, obesity and other the NCDs associated with poor diets, and the environmental concerns together as in one package. Not surprising, countries see these issues in very, very different ways, as do the private sector, civil society groups, and other stakeholders that are part and parcel of the CFS. So while there had been agreement to develop these guidelines, and all of our guidelines are non-binding, voluntary nature, there are wide differences on what specifically the guidelines should recommend to governments and others. So this includes differences about food system models, from industrial ag to agroecology and everything in between. The use of fertilizers and pesticides. I mean, all these things are part of the text that is being negotiated, and clearly a wide variety of views. Things such as definitions. We had a term in the text, healthy, sustainable diets, and that has created quite a conversation around what that means. How is it defined? What exactly would be a healthy, sustainable diet? And this is where we rely on the expertise of the HLPE and other scientific references and text that's already been negotiated by intergovernmental processes, which assist our work. And what relative emphasis should be put on the social or the economic or the environmental aspects of sustainability. So yes, the voluntary guidelines that we are attempting to finalize and adopt in February are ambitious, but they're particularly timely, especially with the UN Food Systems Summit approaching very quickly. And so clearly the CFS has been given a very visible role in the preparations of this summit. And we intend to have these guidelines as a tool that can be used as a global good once they're adopted and finalized. And so that's where we are at the moment, Eric.
Okay,
back to you.
Thank you for that. Dirk, can we turn to you? We heard earlier the perspective from Africa. You are squarely in the private sector, Food Drink Europe organization, and I think your focus is more on Europe, but you correct me if I'm wrong there. And perhaps you could give us a little bit the challenge from your perspective as you see it, and maybe focusing more on Europe then, please.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the WTO while my video disappears.
Okay, as long as
yes, it's going back. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this panel. And also let me take the opportunity to congratulate the WTO on its 25th anniversary, which is quite a milestone. So yes, in Europe, we too are confronted with an imbalanced situation on several fronts. And this largely mimics the situation at global level that Francesco already alluded to. On the one hand, we have some 43 million people in the EU that are not able to afford a quality meal every second day. And these figures are estimated to increase as a result of COVID-19. Sadly, we're seeing that more and more people are forced to go to food banks also here in Europe. And at the same time, we are collectively generating in the EU around 88 million tons of food waste every year. So there is, as the point was made by Chris, this nexus of nutrition, but also the environmental part that we need to look at. And at the same time, that Francesco already mentioned, overweight and obesity figures are going up, have gone up in most, if not all, EU member states over the last decades, with 1 out of 6 adults on average being obese in the EU. I have to say that there is sort of figures are varying across different countries of the European Union. And we have seen also in recent years some positive signs in some countries for certain age groups where obesity in certain younger age groups in particularly is plateauing or even decreasing. So there is a bit of positive news in a lot of negative news, but we are still very far away from halting or reversing the trend of childhood obesity and obesity in Europe. And on top of that, was already mentioned, also the issue of nutritional deficiencies is apparent also in Europe, particularly on vitamin D, vitamin E, iodine deficiency in certain population groups, the elderly and children. If you look at diets, the International Global Burden of Disease Study estimates that when it comes to diets in Europe, the ones that are high in sodium and diets low in whole grain fruits, nuts, and seeds are the top dietary risk factors for lost healthy life years. So there's clearly also a challenge for our industry to make sure that we contribute in a positive way to better diets. And if you look at it from a private sector perspective, the whole situation is, of course, a challenge for us. If you look at the productivity loss it creates, absenteeism in the workplace, but also inefficiencies that are created through waste, as I already referred to. But at the same time, it also offers opportunities for more sustainable production and for innovation. And in fact, here in Europe, we are currently led by a policy initiative called the European Green Deal, and the European Commission recently issued the Farm to Fork strategy, which really intends to make Europe the global leader in food sustainability from a economic, environmental, and social point of view. And of course, there's also an important health pillar in that. So we as a sector are aligning to that agenda and sort of trying to make our strides in more sustainable production and also promoting more sustainable consumption.
Thank you, Dirk. Two things that got stuck in my mind, at least, was this point again on 1 in 6 being obese in the EU, and that healthy foods are not necessarily affordable even within Western countries like within the European Union, which is a point that might seem surprising. Anne-Marie, and we'll come back to more about the private sector in the next round on trade and in policy, what can be done and what the role you have is. But Anne-Marie, if we can wrap up this last round, this first round of questions, which were about the challenges, and we've had a few challenges. You've been working at this based in the University of Sydney for quite some time. From a more global perspective, how would you summarize, or how would you say, what are the main challenges we face in the area of nutrition? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the invitation, and thank you to my panelists. Adding to what's been discussed by the panel so far, I'd like to highlight 2 challenges that I see globally. The first is nutritional inequalities, and the second is the challenge of creating healthy food environments. Nutritional inequalities are a major concern because often the national statistics that we look at can also gloss over some of the specific challenges faced by subpopulation groups, and also mask some of the challenges that differ between countries. Although there is more than enough food produced, access to healthy, affordable food remains challenging, and more so for some population groups and for others. And as Francesco explained, this has really clear implications at a national level. We do see rising prevalence of diet-related chronic diseases that's occurring as a result of increased consumption of particularly highly processed food, high in salt, fat, and sugar, and decreasing consumption of minimally processed healthy foods. What we also see is that historically these diet-related chronic diseases were really seen as were a challenge, particularly for high-income populations and countries. But now we do see this as a global challenge. In fact, the burden of disease lies more heavily in low and middle income countries. The recent Global Nutrition Report also highlighted this double burden of malnutrition. Among children under 5 years of age, nearly 150 million are stunted, another 50 million are wasted, and in addition to this, 40 million are overweight. In the region that I'm working in, the Asia Pacific region, we see this coexistence of the double burden of malnutrition at a national level across the region, with rates of undernutrition slowly declining, but really remaining persistent, and up to 20% undernutrition in some countries, at the same time as the burden of diet-related chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, obesity continues to increase. What we also see, and some recent work in Indonesia has really highlighted this, that the double burden of malnutrition occurs at the household level as well, that we do see, for example, overweight mothers coexisting in the same household as undernourished children, and not because of any intentional shifts, but because I would suggest of the access to cheap calories and highly processed carbohydrates, where when you're a young mother, for example, living on a very, very tight budget, cheap calories form the base of your diet, and we see then the associated overweight, diabetes risk increasing. If you're a small child coexisting on the same diet, you're not getting, as Namakolo pointed out, and Chris also flagged, you're not getting access to the important nourishment that you require for healthy growth. So these challenges that I'm describing as nutritional inequalities, I would say also highlight the importance of the food environments in which people make decisions about the foods they consume. One thing that's becoming increasingly evident, and that we are seeing global commitment for, is creating healthier food environments, because although there are some dimensions of nutrition which do involve individual choice, and are dependent on factors such as nutritional literacy, and decision making. There's also a really strong influence of that environment in which people make decisions about what to consume. Environmental factors such as the price of food, the availability of healthy food, the relative marketing of healthy and unhealthy food, which I suspect we can all see from our own experience tends to be weighted towards less healthy foods, and the characteristics of retail, what's available on the shelf of the stores that we're able to access. These food environment factors lie outside of individual control, and at the moment, I would suggest this is one of the major challenges from a global nutrition perspective, to examine and to really understand better what it looks like for food system transformation to support healthier food environments at a global level.
Okay, thank you very much for that general overview. I think now we have quite clearly set out some of the key challenges that we face at the global level, with an example also from Africa and Europe. Let's move to discussing the role of trade. So the second part of our discussion in this session, where the basic question we have underlying this discussion is, what role does trade play in nutritional outcomes? This is not particularly easy to grapple with, although I have worked with this for most of my professional life. For me, trade is what connects, in a way, production with the consumer. It's a mechanism for bringing food from the farm to the plate that could go over very long distances. It could go over very small local distances. There could be intermediaries, there could be no intermediaries. But I'm wondering, and of course, trade more generally over time has increased incomes, has given people the ability with more income to be able to purchase food. But we have just heard also that healthy food choices are not always affordable, not even in the rich countries. So is it that simple, this notion that with higher incomes, we are simply better off from a food and nutrition perspective? So what is actually the connection between trade, interconnectivity here, and also then nutrition? Anne-Marie, perhaps we can start with you on this, looking more closely at diets here. What are the key drivers of the composition in diet? So when you make a choice for what food you're going to buy, what drives the consumer's choice there, and what role do you think trade plays from that perspective?
Thank you, Eric. I would agree with you and your earlier comments that trade can improve the availability of a stable supply of diverse foods, particularly looking at a national level. And I think this is where the discussion about inequalities and subpopulations become important, because when we look at trade, I think rightly, we're often talking about aggregate national statistics and the implications of trade for national levels of food security, for the availability of food at a national aggregate level. And I think we have seen in the past improvements in food security with liberalisation of trade at that national level. And we've also seen trade as important in smoothing supply. And particularly, there's been some recent work during 2020 around the role of trade in perhaps smoothing some of these supply issues that we have seen in terms of labour force around food production in different countries. Some of the avenues through which trade can affect nutrition also relate to the impact of trade in terms of a more integrated food system and the structure, for example, of food retail and the way that sourcing of foods occurs. And I'm sure Dirk, for example, will talk more about some of these supply chain issues and the impact of trade. We've also seen, though, that trade liberalisation historically has been associated with increasing availability and affordability of highly processed and often less healthy foods. And it's, as you say, not a simple story, but we have seen very much, I guess, this question of not simply is food available, but what is the nutritional quality of the food that is available, or the increased availability of food that we see. Which foods, for example, become cheaper relative to other foods? And in many ways, this issue of nutritional quality is critical and in some ways under-researched. Work that I've done examining trends in food trade at a regional level in Central America, in the Pacific and in Southern Africa have showed that in many ways, due to their shelf life and other considerations, we do see an increase in the availability and the affordability of highly processed, less healthy foods, including snacks, including sugar sweetened beverages and other foods that are associated with the nutrition transition. I'd also like to highlight another interface between trade and diet, because as we start to think about, I would suggest how we can maximize the benefits of trade for diet while also mitigating some of these potential contributions to nutrition transition and this global non-communicable disease epidemic that Francesco talked about. We are also seeing that as countries increasingly seek to regulate products that are associated with poor nutritional health. So for example, regulating products in the form of requiring interpretive front of pack nutrition labels to show the relative healthiness of food. We're also seeing that because these products are highly traded and the products of investment, the policies are being challenged or raised as concerns within trade forums. And I'd suggest that this interface between nutrition and trade at the policy level is also something that will be critical in thinking about food system transformation. And following Namakolo's comment earlier about the potential to redirect food system transformation to promote nutrition and health, those policy levers will be critical, and understanding the trade interface, not simply in the nature of the food supply and how that's impacted, but also in the ability of governments to shape and to influence food supply to improve nutritional outcomes.
Thank you. That's useful, and it brings us to the next question on Chris. I mean, to what extent are these issues actually coming up in the negotiations of the guidelines? Can you very briefly just give us an idea of the dynamic on trade? How does that come up?
Thanks, Eric, and yeah, certainly not an easy issue. And let me just say again, or not again, but say for at least for the record that my views are my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee or its members, but look, the CFS mandate is ending hunger and malnutrition. Trade clearly has a major impact on the way food is grown and consumed locally, regionally, and globally. And so trade touches upon all the pillars of food security that we work with: availability, access, utilization, and stability. Now, CFS members differ over how trade should or maybe should not be addressed within CFS, some arguing that politically sensitive issues like trade are best addressed in Geneva at the WTO, or on food safety and phytosanitary standards within Codex at FAO and WHO. Makes perfect sense. But we know food security and nutrition are far bigger than trade deals and food safety, which is why there are trade-related issues that do come up in our work, including the draft voluntary guidelines. So, whatever your views on the topic, one of the critical issues that has come from this COVID-19 pandemic certainly is on the minds and the tongues of those of our members, particularly during several events we've held during this past year. It's the issue of resilience. In other words, is the international trading system able to withstand massive stresses such as this global pandemic, questions about who's benefiting, who's suffering, how are workers being treated, how are rights being protected, should there be a heavier focus on local trade, or perhaps even self-sufficiency at national levels. And I know you've brought that up in your paper. So in January this year, the CFS chair and I met with Alan Wolf in Berlin at the GFFA, where both the chair of the CFS and Alan were invited to speak about the links between trade and food security. We all know they're there, but we haven't engaged closely as organizations and constituencies. So we agreed in that meeting that our work clearly overlaps. We should be aware of what each other is doing and should remain in touch. A senior WTO rep was among the panelists at a side event at our October high-level special event, along with a senior rep from OECD who was just on your last panel. So the conversation is starting. It perhaps you could argue is overdue, but they do factor in, these questions do factor into the draft voluntary guidelines. But look, we're all clear, trade is complex, as your other panelists have spelled out. There's positives and there's negatives. As far as CFS is concerned, our work is very strongly rooted in the right to food, the progressive realization thereof, and geared toward helping the most poor and the most vulnerable. So in this light, in 2016, I'd point out that we negotiated policy recommendations on connecting smallholders to markets, which had 24 specific recommendations that are still every bit as valid today as they were 4 years ago. Our RIE principles, these are responsible agriculture investment principles, also one of our most visible and important products, go to the heart of investment, particularly in land, which also has major implications for trade, international, national, regional. So I'd point out two other things. There's the scientific group paper that was done for Action Track 4 of the Food Systems Summit addresses the links between trade and food security. And I know that that conversation will be part of the action track and part of the summit discussion. It also uses the conceptual framework on food systems that was at the heart of the CFS HLPE report number 12. And one last part of the CFS work that does touch upon trade is the CFS HLPE's report number 15. This is the 2030 synthesis report, which summarizes CFS work over the past decade and makes recommendations for what the committee should be doing over the coming decade of action with other partners like WTO and others in the international environment. So back to you, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Namukolo, I mean, Chris mentioned words like resilience and self-sufficiency. I'm curious what your perspective is from the African continent and also with respect to countries that may be food insecure. How do you see trade there in the future? What is your perspective on this? I'd be curious about that.
So trade is already an important aspect of meeting food security and nutrition on the African continent. The balance of trade is important, especially for staples. And what we know is the fact that it's currently, from a continental perspective, it's not in the continent's favor in that we are not net importers of the imported staples like wheat, rice, and maize. It varies between countries. There are some that are net exporters, but as a continent, we are net importers. Given that the continent is highly dependent on cereal staples for food, trade is then critical in terms of playing a balancing aspect for food security. We are doing better for roots and tubers, but this might be because of the cumbersome nature of transporting these in other places. But a good example in terms of the nuance that is required from a country perspective is Botswana, a country where 80 to 90% of the cereal needs are imported, most of them from the neighboring country, South Africa. But the country is actually a net exporter of beef products. And about 85% of the beef produced is actually exported. So that gives you this example of the fact that there is some nuance. And this is an example of a country where in an area where they have a comparative advantage, they are net exporters. In an area, because the country is semi-arid and desert, cereals are difficult to produce. There they are excessively net importers. in the long term, for a long time, Botswana's food security strategy has been different from many African countries in that the only area where they have sought self-sufficiency is in the livestock industry. But for cereal production, they've sought to increase production only in those areas of the country where there is some suitability for production to be done. But trade across African countries need to be promoted. Most African countries tend to target trade outside the continent than with each other. And so the recent Africa Continental Trade-Free Agreement is actually an important aspect that hopefully will increase trade across African countries to allow movement of food, different types of food from excess areas to deficit areas according to suitability for production. The fruit and vegetable trade story is one of sadness. Earlier on, we were being told about how during the COVID pandemic, several African countries were exporting fruit to Europe. The sad part of that is that we are not consuming enough fruits or vegetables on the continent. And when it comes to trade on food, on fruits and vegetables, we are geared towards exporting out of our countries into Europe than amongst ourselves within the continent. And so that's an area where I think some improvement is required. Then, of course, there is the issue of climate variability that we need to deal with. And here, what we see is the fact that we really need to address issues of emergencies such as the locust infestations. Trade can help us address issues in those times of need. And it's an area that is actually required. But I also think trade can be a double-edged sword for African countries. And here I want to give an example of Ethiopia, specifically to do with the staple cereal teff that has gained much popularity elsewhere in the world to an extent that it has transitioned to becoming a cash crop where it was being exported in large amounts. And because of that, there's been also some transition of people producing more maize to an extent that the government had banned the export of teff over a period of time. And this has now been released and relaxed, and they are now exporting. But these are some of those issues where trade is good, but trade sometimes brings some trade-offs that then need to be managed. And I think from government perspective, what is important is how do we manage those trade-offs without creating bigger problems in the process. In conclusion, what I want to say is that trade can balance supplies, but can also bring challenges. And a balance is needed to make sure that where there is need, you bring in trade. Where you don't need it, you might balance that. But it's really, I think the million-dollar question is what type of policy instruments do we need to create that balance without generating problems that we don't necessarily want? Thank you.
You put your finger on a very, very important issue. Exactly what you call the million-dollar question is what policy can address this issue. And we'll come back to this on policy, but I'd like to first ask both Dirk and Francesco, but beginning with Dirk, briefly here, because I'm looking at the clock. Sometimes the private sector is accused of contributing to the crisis in terms of health and nutrition by promoting products that could be high in salt or sugar or fats. As a representative from the Food and Drinks Producers Association, so I'm curious about how you would respond to this and what role do you think the private sector has in this area before we go and look at governments next?
I think I firmly believe that the private sector is more part of the solution than part of the problem. Of course, it's clear that we have a shared responsibility in ensuring that there are sufficient and affordable nutritious options that consumers can choose from, that products are promoted responsibly and transparently, and also that food production as a whole is made more sustainable. And by sustainable, we mean from farm to fork. So the responsibility for us does not end in the processing sector, but it is also on how can we improve agricultural yields, the environmental sustainability of farming, up until how can we motivate consumers to go to more nutritious, healthy options. And there's a lot of work ongoing in that area, and a lot of work still to be done. Just to give an example, on average, every 1 out of 2 products you find on the supermarket shelves in Europe today will have been replaced by new ones within a period of 5 years' time, either by improving the recipes, less salt, more fiber, and so forth, but also through brand new product innovations. So we're seeing now, for instance, a big surge in plant-based products, for example. But at the same time, that does not mean that we have to give up or put in a bad daylight quality products like our Italian Parmigiano Reggiano, or a nice piece of chocolate, or a bag of salt and vinegar crisps, just to give an example, which are often indeed high in calories or fat or salt or sugar, but which can fit in a healthy and balanced diet if you consume it in moderation. So we should recognize, I think, as well, that food is more than just a set of individual nutrients, and that it has also a very important social role, and we're seeing that now also in the pandemic. Let me maybe make a few comments on the role of trade in this as well. I think, first of all, we're seeing in these pandemic times how, and we're rediscovering how important trade and uninterrupted cross-border movement is for the proper functioning of food supply chains, whether they are global or local or anything in between. And we're actually quite proud that we've been able to keep the supermarket shelves stocked, both in terms of quantity, but also I think in terms of quality across Europe, despite the pressures that we faced in terms of border closures and trade barriers. But it is obvious that food systems are being tested, and we heard already about that this afternoon. I think we very much appreciate the joint call that came out from the Director Generals from the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and the Food and Agriculture Organization about the importance to keep food trade flowing in response to COVID-19. But I think more generally, it is not only about keeping food trade flowing for the sake of functioning food supply chains, but also to support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think in that regard, our call is really for open, fair, and rule-based trade that is based on common international standards, such as those established by Codex Alimentarius, as a way to ensure that we can not only provide enough food to the growing population worldwide, but also, as was said before, enough quality food. So food security, but also nutrition security should be the objective there. At the same time, I think other panelists have already mentioned that trade and nutrition is rather complex. I think we cannot expect that that trade will solve unhealthy diets or malnutrition or food insecurity as such. It needs to be complemented by local and national policies, action on the ground, and so forth. And I think there's an important capacity building role for multilateral organizations to make sure that both at the national but also at the international place there are norms, etc., in place that sort of move into the direction of more sustainable production and consumption.
Thank you, Dirk. Francesco, I'll come back to you. A bit of a long gap, but it's because you started the first round and you're last in the second round. But the focus of WHO is, of course, on health and not on trade. We do cooperate. We have over the years, but in a way, I'm putting a little bit the same question I posed Anne-Marie at the outset of this round on when we're discussing trade. From your perspective, could you close off on this discussion here, what do you see as the role of trade in driving dietary change?
Yeah, Eric, thank you. And yes, we have collaborated on this, and we're actually happy to leave our comfort zone and deal with other sectoral policies, because that's the only way in nutrition. But trade and investment, particularly for improved nutrition, is one of the 6 action areas of the Decade of Action on Nutrition, which is going on. And we're in the middle of it. It's the Decade of Action declared by the General Assembly of the United Nations 2016-2025. And the decade is a work program that states that rules governing trade and investment have become increasingly important to food systems. Trade and investment agreements affect how the food system functions at global, regional, national, and local levels, influencing food prices, availability, access, and consumption, as well as nutrition outcomes, food safety, and dietary options. And it also states that coherence between trade and nutrition policies is vital. Trade policies and agreements should support the implementation of nutrition policies and programs and should not negatively impact the right to adequate food in other countries. So the basis is really to have the clarity around the food and nutrition policies, and not to develop trade policies that are compromise and pursue other objectives, which is mainly economic objectives. And this area of action actually builds on the framework for action of the Second International Conference of Nutrition. And I think that conference was really important because it, for the first time, was very clearly identifying a series of actions in all the policy space. And this framework for action has actually been endorsed by the member states. So this is always a reminder to Chris that the voluntary guidelines should really comply with those guidelines. Anyway, 2 recommendations were contained in that framework for action. Number 1, actually recommendation number 17, it says we encourage governments, United Nations agencies, programs and funds, World Trade Organization, and other international organizations to identify opportunities to achieve global food and nutrition targets through trade and investment policies. So actually it says, well, can you be a bit creative? What are the gaps there? What kind of encouragement we can make to those who are negotiating international trade agreements to focus on certain items and not others, and make sure that eventually those agreements pursue the nutrition goals. And recommendation number 18 says, improve the availability and access of the food supply through appropriate trade agreements and policies, and endeavor to ensure that such agreements and policies do not have a negative impact on the right to adequate food in other countries. So this interdependence also is so critical. So as also mentioned by fellow panelists, clearly trade has an important role in ensuring food security, and also respect of Codex standards ensures that food is safe. And COVID-19 has shown that the disruption of food trade, whether it's in the circulation of commodities or the function of the retail system, has a negative impact on people's nutrition and health. However, as shown by Anne-Marie, trade can also be an avenue for shaping the food environment in a different direction from that indicated by food-based dietary guidelines, and increase the availability and access of foods and drinks high in fat, sugar, and salt. And this is now happening particularly in middle-income countries. I mean, the sales of processed food and drinks is actually flattening or even decreasing in some income countries, but it's steadily increasing in low and middle-income countries. So I agree with Namukolo that we should have policies that make the best use of trade. And some countries are actually trying this, are trying to protect themselves with import policies that put restrictions on certain products. And they need to be helped. And I know that you, Eric, and your team are trying to help them respect the Treaty on Technical Barriers to Trade. So it can be done, but it has to be done in a certain way. And I'd like to close by saying that food really should not be seen as a commodity to maximize profits, but responds to human needs with the limits posed by the planet. So I think that should be the priority. It's not, they're not on an equal stand. I actually think that health and sustainability are more important than profit.
Thank you. Thank you for those clear points. And in a way, you have brought us to the last round. We have 20 minutes left here, so I'd like you briefly to respond to the next couple of questions in this round. But now, so we started with the challenges. We looked at the role of trade, and now we have come into the perhaps the most complex area. But what should the policy response be? I mean, we heard from all of you there are positive outcomes from trade. We have seen that in many different areas, and I'm not going into them all. But there are also negative outcomes from trade. So how do you make sure that governments in their policy responses are promoting the former and trying to mitigate the latter? So what kinds of instruments could they use? Francesco, you had already started to some extent on this, but in your experience and having looked at this, do you have any ideas or examples of effective and coherent policy networks, or sorry, not policy, but policies of governments to try to improve nutrition outcomes, that would nudge consumers and producers in the right direction? Just briefly on that point, you said something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, but yes, WTO is analyzing the evidence on effectiveness of current policies and looking at the good practices. So let me say, what are the one that we identify as a priority, and let me give you 5. So first, taxation of foods and beverages. And there's evidence of an effect of taxation of sugar sweetened beverages on price change, sales, and consumption. The higher the tax, the greater the impact. We have a great example from Mexico, and now we have 74 countries that are implementing the taxation of sugar sweetened beverages based on the data we have. Not in the same way, so some could do better, but definitely this is one important avenue. Number 2, interpretive nutrition labeling of food. If we provide convenient, relevant, readily understood nutrition information and guidance on food packages, we can assist consumers to make informed food purchases and healthier eating choices. But we can also stimulate compositional changes to food products, because producers will make sure that their products are actually labeled in a way that's not decreasing consumption. So they shift. So we have examples from Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, Israel, France, Australia, to just name a few countries that have used this front of the pack labeling to guide consumers' choices. We have actually a list of 37 countries that are using front of the pack labeling, most of them in the European region. And normally, what you have to have on the labels is related to energy, salt, total sugars, saturated fats, and total fat. Third policy areas is regulating marketing food and beverage to children to prevent influences on children's food preferences and that-related behaviors and outcomes. And some countries have done this through statutory regulations, and some through voluntary measures. But the statutory regulations are the ones that are demonstrated effective, and we have notable examples in UK and Chile. Fourth, the school food standards, very effective at increasing the availability and purchase of healthy food and decreasing the purchase of unhealthy food with the potential to impact health. And public food procurements have a great potential to influence people's diet and the food environment. Just to give a number, only in the European Union, public institutions buy food for over 80 billion euro every year. So can you imagine the potential of shaping the system? And fifth, the reformulation of food and beverage products, which is implemented to reduce the content of saturated fat, trans fat, sugars, salt. We've had some good progress on elimination of trans fat, industrial trans fat. 58 countries have introduced so far laws which protects about half of mankind, humankind, but still a lot to do. Consumer information, important, complementary tool. Other forms of behavioral change is also useful. But of course, the upstream intervention in the food supply, such as public investment in infrastructure or agricultural subsidies, have an enormous power. They're not used enough. But this only works if there's an alignment of the purposes of policy. So there's no single bullet. We need to have a comprehensive approach.
Okay, thanks. That was really clear and helpful. Chris, very briefly, perhaps, is there any comment you have from your perspective on this issue of policy?
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I mean, policy is at the heart of what the CFS does and is about. And you would ask me about stakeholder involvement, and to speak about that. I mean, the CFS essentially is the poster child of multi-stakeholder engagement within the UN system, right? We have 130 state members. We have an advisory group comprised of the 3 Rome-based agencies, the private sector, civil society, WHO, UN Nutrition, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the World Bank, CGIAR, Gates, others. So it is as inclusive as any other committee in the UN system, and it shows. While our products are voluntary and non-binding in nature, the inclusivity gives a huge level of credibility and legitimacy to the products that we promulgate. So, look, in terms of good practices as well, I'd encourage you all to engage widely, engage often, and be willing to address the concerns of all parties, right? At the heart of the voluntary guidelines, and particularly the discussion we are having around innovative practices in agroecology and other innovative approaches. The question of power imbalances comes up quite frequently. It also comes up in the HLPE's 2030 synthesis report, in which the HLP proposes both sustainability and agency as 2 new elements of the food security pillars on top of the 4 I mentioned. So, addressing power imbalances, addressing and including those who are not traditionally at the table, indigenous communities. You've seen in the U.S. where I'm from, COVID just decimated indigenous communities, people of color, low-income communities, and the comorbidities, the NCDs associated with poor diets and poverty are just that much more obvious in this COVID scenario. So, I would say, as an example, with the voluntary guidelines that we're doing now, we took the HLP reports. We drafted a text for negotiation, then we did an e-consultation, and then we went around the world, 6 different regional consultations, and we got the views and the input of countries and constituencies from all around the world. So it's not a European perspective, it's not an American perspective, it's not a North perspective. It is genuinely global, and that was instrumental in giving us a draft and an approach that reflected not just a narrow perspective, but a global one. So, look, trade has benefited a lot of people, right? I'm certainly happy I can eat an avocado from Mexico and curry from Thailand on any given day. And it allows, because I know what I'm eating, I know what I'm buying, and I can afford it, which is key, as Sophie Report has pointed out, is not an option for hundreds of millions. It's benefiting those who, with the access and the affordability questions, and who understand, as Francesca was saying, these issues, how to read a label, how to understand what a trans fat is, or levels of salt and sugar, et cetera. So, look, markets are great, but they do fail. There are externalities. There's skewed information on the markets themselves, access to credit, technologies, education levels, balance of power, et cetera. So, look, I would point out, because I think it is a fantastic opportunity for all of us, in this UN Food Systems Summit, there is a process of conducting national dialogues. Obviously not compulsory, not everyone will have them, but it is an opportunity for countries and others, but countries mainly, to have their own CFS at country level to engage stakeholders in this food system dialogue and process, to get their views, to get their inputs, and help and build a more food systems that are more reflective of everybody who's affected by them. So that's a great opportunity. I hope we all partake in. So thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Chris. Anne-Marie, I had a question to you I was thinking about the issue of coherence, and to some degree, this is something Francesco has brought up and several others. To me, it seems like as transformation of food systems would mean that you would have to have quite a big degree of coordination, both internally and internationally. I mean, thinking of sugar as one example, I mean, there are cases where a government might be subsidizing sugar, but another part of the same government might actually be doing things to try to get people to stop eating sugar. So within governments, you need better coordination. And at the international level, also there, coherence must be important. And I think the international standard setting community has a very important role to play in this context, if you would want to comment on that.
Thank you, Eric. And I think in my comment, I'd like to address this issue of policy coherence, and following Francesco and also Chris's comments, I'd suggest that moving towards policy coherence will need to happen on two levels. And one is an underlying paradigm level, and the other is the more technical level that you note. So first of all, I would suggest that underlying the current policy and coherence that we see, which manifests at a national and an international level sometimes, is a fundamental difference in the way that food is considered as a public policy concern. So as an example, food is essential, fundamental to life and health, and the health sector is tending to regulate food, or seeking to regulate food, as an input to human health. This is how they understand the issue of food, as a regulatory issue. But at the same time, the food sector is also a major contributor to economies around the world in terms of primary production, processing, manufacturing, retail. And as such, the economic sector, departments of industry, trade, of course, are focusing on regulating food in relation to its contribution to livelihoods, employment, and economic growth. These are all very legitimate public policy objectives across the board. And I'd suggest that one of the key steps to moving towards policy coherence in this space is enabling a discussion, which I think the Food Systems Summit will enable, about the multiple objectives that food systems serve as a public policy issue, and to articulate the goal of food systems as one that is across multiple objectives, improving outcomes for nutrition, the environment, and the economy. And this is an important start. The next step is to also think about the technical and political considerations in addressing policy coherence, to examine trade-offs and opportunities. So the example of sugar you gave is an excellent one. I understand that, for example, the government of Malaysia decided to remove its sugar subsidies when the issue of sugar as a health issue came onto the policy agenda, and it started to consider measures such as a tax on sugar sweetened beverages. So we are seeing these instances of governments thinking about the technical implications. And then at a very specific technical level, I think in some ways we see leadership definitely at the global level. And one of the issues is, for example, the development of codex, of a new standard on food labeling and addressing front of pack labeling. And what's, I think, important about the nature of an institution like codex is the fact that it does explicitly consider health, consumer protection issues, as well as economic and trade issues explicitly. And I think this bringing together of multiple objectives from around food is going to be critical in addressing policy coherence.
Thank you for that. Namukolo, when we have spoken about this on previous occasions, I'm curious about your views on the policy side. I think you have told me, I might have got you wrong, but sometimes there is a tendency not to look beyond production when you're thinking about policy. You know, and it tends to focus on the producers, and one has to look at as a policy aspect food systems more generally. Would you like to comment on this point?
Yes, absolutely. So I would like to respond to your question by giving a couple of examples quickly. Ethiopia experienced devastating famines in the 1980s, following which government embarked on quite an ambitious food security strategy that improved both production and productivity of cereal staples in particular. What we've ended up with is relatively good production of those commodities. However, less attention was paid to fruits and vegetables. Essentially, what we've ended up with is this work that's been done by IFPRI that's shown between 2000 and 2016, the prices of cereals in real terms have actually gone down in Ethiopia, making them more affordable. But when you look at fruits and vegetables, animal-derived foods, the groups where you want consumption to increase in order to address nutrition, those have gone up in prices during those period anywhere from 22 to 62%. So the foods that you want to be consumed more of have actually increased. And this has been related to the policy instruments that were in place. And then for sugars and oils, where there's been some level of subsidization, their prices have actually gone down 22 to 30%. And then you take another example is look at the US and South Africa, both strong agriculture countries with low undernourishment levels in terms of energy supply at 6% and 3% of the population. Well, knowing that it's a national statistic and at subnational level, there are some variations. However, in spite of this, South Africa has a 27% prevalence of stunting. And I already alluded to how bad the situation is with respect to overweight and obesity. And for the US, of course, we know they are somewhere in the 50s for overweight and obesity prevalence, at least among women. And so production is not good enough because even those countries that have good agriculture production sectors still have problems of multiples of malnutrition. And therefore, really, we need to look at the food system more holistically. And I think the 5 areas of intervention that Francesca talked about earlier would be a good place to start with proven areas where we know we have seen some positive outcomes. That's why I feel production alone can't help us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So Dirk, how about the responsibility of the private sector in this area? And if you look at policy and what governments do, are there things that you do not want governments to do or that you think they should be doing in order to promote the right kind of outcomes? Please go ahead.
Yes, I think it's clear that we have a responsibility, as I said before, and together with others, farmers, retailers, and so forth, to ensure that there's a diversity of affordable nutrition options available, that there's clear information on products that allows consumers to make informed choices, and that we improve the way that we do business in a more sustainable way. So in the end, it comes down to producing food that people like, minimizing impacts on the environment and health, while supporting fair incomes and livelihood for farmers and for producers. And I think that's sort of to the point that was made before. I think we have to look at it much more from a food systems perspective. And I think the private sector companies are having to do that anyway. When we are talking about nutrition and salt reduction, for example, we also need to look at food safety. We need to look at, does it create food waste if we reduce salt and take out some nutrients and so forth. So I think we need to look at it much more in a holistic way. When it comes to policy, I'd say that we see the fruits of supportive, incentivizing government policies more so than punitive approaches. And this is particularly relevant for the small, medium-sized companies in our sector. And for speaking from a European point of view, 99% of the 290,000 companies are small and medium-sized. They often don't have the capacities or the technological knowledge or skills to make steps on, for instance, reformulation or innovation of their products. So I think some of the success stories that we've seen in countries in the EU is working together in tandem with the government and the industry, setting benchmarks, but also providing the supportive elements of overcoming overcoming technological barriers to certain reformulations, or investing in consumer awareness campaigns, and that really has worked. And one of such examples is in Denmark, where the Danish government, the Ministry of Health, but also the Ministry of Economic Affairs, teamed up with the industry, with the bakery industry, the cereals and ingredient producers, but also the retailers, and also health NGOs like diabetes associations, to improve the consumption of whole grain in the diet of Danish citizens. And over a period of 7 years, they managed to triple the intake of whole grain in the population. So sort of this comprehensive and concerted approach, in a way like an orchestra, where you have the government in the lead, being the conductor, the private sector, the NGO community, and so forth, all involved and all playing their part. I think that has been really the way how you can get very concrete and efficient and effective results.
Good, thank you. A positive note here towards the end. Even the lights are going off behind me, but I've been told that that we have a few more minutes. There's no other panel behind us, so if participants who are with us on Zoom or YouTube or other social media will bear with us, I would simply like to ask the panel, because it's been a very rich discussion, if in one or two sentences now, as a way of concluding, what message on the issue of subject of nutrition and trade, and considering all the challenges we heard now at the outset, what message would you bring the UN Food Summit, let's get this right, the UN Food System Summit that's taking place 2021, if you could, or what outcome would you ask for it? But very briefly, please. Maybe we'll go in the opposite order. I'll start with Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Eric. My key take home from this really rich discussion is about the importance of dialogue in thinking about food systems as achieving multiple objectives, to redress perhaps some of the focus on national aggregate perspectives with a focus on inequality and addressing those inequalities, and to also redress perhaps a historical focus from a policy perspective at least on that has perhaps neglected nutrition, with bringing nutrition to the table. And I think there's been a lot of really positive examples of where that's occurred. So dialogue and bringing nutrition to the fore in these discussions.
Thank you. Dirk.
I'd say that first and foremost, open, fair, rule-based trade is instrumental in achieving food and nutrition security and sustainability in all of its pillars. And I think we have to really connect the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainability here. And that requires a better understanding of the complexity and trade-offs. And I hope that the UN Food Systems Summit will be that occasion to have an open conversation with everyone around the table to understand those trade-offs, but also the opportunities in working together in a much more concerted way than we do before.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. I would point out, and it's a great panel, great discussions, a couple of things that did not come up, including sort of redirecting public support in certain ways that do have an impact on trade. I know that is a part of what the summit is looking at, as well as the macroeconomic data around trade-offs. And Marie talked about the policy coherence, which is really kind of at the heart of what the summit is trying to push, and getting the food security and nutrition communities together with the health community and the environmental community together on a single page, or rowing together in the same direction to get at the all 17 of the SDGs. So the summit obviously is important. But the CFS was born out of a summit in '74. It was changed in '96 with another summit, reformed completely in 2009 with that summit, and it will exist probably long after next year's summit. And we'll keep supporting the issues, the complex issues around food security. We will support what the members prioritize, and they have prioritized, I'll let you know, in addition to these voluntary guidelines on food systems, also the innovative approaches that I mentioned earlier, including agroecological and other approaches. And we also will address gender equality and women's empowerment, youth, data systems. So we actually have countries have the data that they need to make informed decisions. That's a huge issue that has not been discussed yet. And then inequalities in the fourth year of our 4-year program of work. So we invite you all to continue being part of our discussions, our policy convergence, and certainly welcome the dialogue between the CFS and the WTO continuing and becoming strengthened where appropriate. So thank you.
Thank you. Namukolo.
Yes, some quick asks for me is to look at the food systems transformation very holistically. Picking lessons, I think both Dirk and Francesca talked about some positive trends that have been observed in Europe, more whole grains being consumed and what have you. Whereas on the African continent, our trajectory is still going in the other direction. To bring those lessons into our discussions so that we can hopefully change course as we seek to transform our food system. That's on the one hand. The other one is, as we do that, to keep in mind that the African continent has got continental policy instruments such as the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program that is well positioned to pick up a food systems transformation agenda, to make sure that that is also linked to the discussions. And finally, Africa is a continent where governments are very constrained in terms of finances. We've been going through a horrible pandemic. It is still with us. But somehow people have been trying to cope with whatever they have been doing, both the private sector as well as the smallholder farmers, individual households. What are the lessons that we can learn, that we can bring forth where we might find some entry points for interventions going forward? I think those lessons we need to try and harness and take those with us in the discussions on transforming food systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Namukolo. Francesco.
Eric, I'll just give you a tweet. It's a call. Analyze the nutrition impact of trade policies domestically and internationally, and take corrective measures to align them to the dietary guidelines. How about that?
That's good. I'm going to bring it to Anita.
Wonderful.
That's great. So let me thank so much the five of you. I think you brought a wealth of information. Two words in wrapping up, because I think there was so much said, it's a pity just to leave it at that. But I said at the beginning that we would try to unpack this discussion. I think you unpacked it so well, it's impossible for me to repackage now and give you a very clear conclusion. But I think from the challenges discussion, it became very clear, and I don't have to repeat the figures, that there is a very big global burden with respect to health in terms of hunger and malnutrition that is very high. You painted that picture, I think, very clearly. And I think it's something that deserves attention at the highest level from very many organizations. And WTO is one of them, but only one of them. I think there are others of squarely expertise in this area. On trade, how should I put this? I think the question is not really trade per se, but I think it's what, I think Anne-Marie put it very well. It's what we trade. What is it we are trading? We humans have always traded. I think there's a quote, and I don't remember who said this, but you know, in order to trade, you have to first put down the sword. So we've always been good at trading. But the question is whether what we can do to make sure that the trade that does take place is one that is sustainable from a health and diets perspective. We spoke about, I think it was the director, Edwini, at the very beginning spoke about chocolate, but if we only traded in chocolate, we would not achieve that balance. Of course, you have to have a very, very wide range of issues that are traded. So that brought us into, I mean, that's that to say that trade brings both good and bad, and one can see it from that perspective. And so the question of policy becomes front and center. That was the last point of our discussion. I think it's very important that governments take measures which nudge both consumers and producers in the right directions. There were some questions that were more directed actually to the WTO, so I did not pass them to you, but one of them was on what rules do we have on nutrition and trade policy. And the only point I would make with respect to that is that governments have the full right to take policies which are about nutrition and about health in the same way as they have right to protect the environment. That's very clear. It's how they do that. And they need to be done in a way that is efficient, but the trade disciplines should not be what gets in the way of countries that are trying to achieve these policy outcomes that you have been speaking so well about. It's not that. And it's often the case that WTO rules are used by actors as an excuse for inaction or trying to prevent the governments from doing things. We have seen this very often at the WTO. So I think that's very important with respect to trade policy. I don't think trade policy should be the center of this discussion. It's part of it, but it should definitely not get in the way of legitimate health policy efforts that governments have. And in this, the regulatory side is very important, and the setting of international standards, which we didn't talk too much about, I think is very important. One last thought in discussing this and on the policy part is that maybe the attention to nutrition needs to come at a higher level of governance, not within the silos of different ministries. One probably has to have a very broad perspective on this. So with those very few words, I thank you very much for having taken the time and being part of this discussion. That brings us to the end of session 3, the end of the day, the first day of the symposium. Let me remind everyone that session 4 on agricultural trade, pathways and environment and sustainability will start at 10 a.m. and tomorrow, so join us then. And with that, have a good evening if you're here, or afternoon or night or morning, wherever you are. So take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Bye-bye.
Oh.